My late wife's gold pendant was the only piece of her I had left. When I found the velvet box empty, my own daughter looked me dead in the eye and said she sold it to fund a luxury vacation. But when I tracked down the pawn shop, the owner told me the pendant held a secret compartment. Inside was a hidden memory card that unraveled a terrifying conspiracy against my life. I am Cyrus. I am 69 years old. I am a retired structural engineer and a man who learned the hard way that blood does not guarantee loyalty. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to my bedroom and walked straight to the mahogany dresser. The morning sun illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. The velvet-lined oak box sat exactly where I left it yesterday morning. I opened the brass latch. The interior was completely empty. Naomi's gold pendant was gone. A cold knot formed in my chest. I turned around and marched down the hallway. My daughter Kendra was standing in the brightly lit foyer. She was violently yanking the zipper closed on a massive designer suitcase. Bradley, her husband, leaned against the front door frame. He tapped his expensive leather shoe impatiently against the hardwood floor. I demanded to know where the necklace was. Kendra did not even flinch. She snapped the luggage lock into place and stood up to face me. She looked at me with an expression completely devoid of guilt. Her posture was defiant and rigid. I waited for an explanation. I waited for her to deny taking it. Instead, she offered me a reality check. She crossed her arms and let out a sharp sigh. She told me she sold the necklace yesterday morning to a local dealer. She stated they needed the extra cash to upgrade their flight to Paris to first class. I stared at my own flesh and blood in absolute disbelief. I asked her how she could trade her mother's memory for a larger airplane seat. She rolled her eyes and grabbed her expensive cashmere coat from the rack. She said the dead do not need gold. She claimed the pendant was entirely useless, sitting in a wooden box while she had actual living to do. Bradley chuckled from the doorway. He adjusted his heavy silver watch and smirked at me. He told me I needed to let go of the past. He called me dangerously sentimental. He said clinging to dead metal was pathetic for a man my age. I felt the blood rushing to my ears. I stepped forward to demand the name of the buyer. Bradley immediately stepped in front of Kendra. He puffed out his chest to physically block my path. He told me to back off. He warned me not to ruin their vacation with my unnecessary emotional baggage. He grabbed the heavy suitcase and kicked the front door wide open. Kendra followed him out without a single backward glance. She told me to lock the deadbolt and remember to take my blood pressure pills. They walked down the concrete driveway completely indifferent to the sheer devastation they had just caused in my home. They loaded the luggage into their waiting town car. The engine revved loudly in the quiet neighborhood. I watched them drive away, realizing I was entirely alone. I stood in the silent foyer and watched the red taillights of their car disappear down the suburban street. I turned around and walked slowly back to my bedroom. I picked up the empty oak box. This small wooden container was the only personal possession I brought with me when I moved into Kendra's guest room. Naomi lost her brutal battle with cancer exactly 6 months ago. The overwhelming medical bills temporarily drained the liquid cash we had on hand. Kendra offered me a place to stay while I organized my finances and figured out my next steps. I thought she was acting out of genuine familial love. Now I realized she simply wanted to monitor me. She wanted to slowly strip away the final pieces of my independence. I worked as a structural engineer for 40 years. I built massive steel bridges designed to withstand earthquakes. I knew exactly how to detect a hidden fracture in a solid foundation. My daughter's sudden generosity was a massive structural flaw I had deliberately chosen to ignore out of grief. I gripped the empty box in my large hands. The pendant inside was not just a piece of jewelry. It was the very first gift I ever bought Naomi with my first professional paycheck. Kendra knew exactly what that gold meant to me. She sold it anyway. I closed the latch and placed the box back on the dresser. I refused to let my anger turn into a useless screaming match. I needed to act immediately. I needed to recover the necklace before it was melted down or sold off to an anonymous buyer. Time was running out. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed my phone. I opened the internet browser and searched for every pawn shop and jewelry exchange within a 10-mile radius. I wrote down a list of 12 locations on a notepad. I began dialing the numbers one by one. I asked the same precise question to every clerk who answered. I described a vintage gold pendant with a unique floral engraving on the back. The first 6 shops told me they had not seen anything matching that description. I crossed their names off my notepad. I dialed the seventh number. The shop was located in a gritty commercial district just outside the city limits. A man named Sal answered the phone. His voice was raspy and tired. I gave him the exact description of the necklace. I mentioned the specific weight and the floral pattern. Sal went silent for a few seconds. He told me he bought a piece exactly like that less than an hour ago. He said a white man in a designer suit brought it in. I asked him to hold the item. I told him I would pay whatever he wanted. Sal let out a heavy breath. He told me I needed to get there immediately. He said the man who sold it just called back in an absolute panic. The man was offering triple the original price to buy it back. Sal then dropped a detail that froze the blood in my veins. He said he accidentally dropped the pendant on the counter. The impact triggered a hidden clasp. The medallion popped open. I gripped the phone tightly. I never knew the pendant opened. I pressed the phone tight against my ear. My pulse hammered a steady rhythm against my skull. I gave Sal the exact dimensions of the pendant. I described the heavy 14-karat gold chain and the intricate floral engraving Naomi had custom designed. Sal did not hesitate. He confirmed he had it in his possession. He told me a man sold it to him just an hour ago. I asked him to describe the seller. Sal described a tall white man in his late 30s wearing a tailored navy suit and an expensive silver watch. He mentioned the man reeked of expensive cologne and spoke with a frantic arrogance. It was Bradley. My son-in-law had pawned the last physical memory of my wife for pocket change. I offered Sal double whatever Bradley had accepted. I told him I would drive over right now to hand him the cash. Sal let out a harsh, dry cough over the receiver. He told me to keep my money for a moment. He said there was something I needed to know before I made the drive. The pendant was not just a heavy piece of solid gold. Sal explained that he had taken the necklace to the back room to appraise its weight and purity. He had handled thousands of jewelry pieces in his 30 years running the shop. He noticed a microscopic seam running along the edge of the floral pattern. The gold was hollow. My breath caught in my throat. I had held that pendant in my hands 100 times. I had secured the clasp around Naomi's neck for decades. I never felt a seam. I asked Sal what he meant. Sal told me the pendant was a meticulously crafted locket. Sal explained his process with clinical precision. He was wiping a small smudge of dirt from the floral engraving with a microfiber cloth. He applied too much pressure to the right side of the metal casing. A tiny, practically invisible latch released under his thumb. The front of the gold medallion sprang open on a microscopic hinge. I gripped the kitchen counter to steady my trembling legs. I demanded to know what was inside. Sal lowered his voice to a near whisper. He said he found two distinct objects tucked into a layer of dense foam padding. The first was a standard black micro SD memory card. The second was a tiny brass key with a unique serial number stamped onto its flat edge. My mind raced to process the information. Naomi wore that necklace to every anniversary dinner, every doctor appointment, and every quiet evening we spent on the porch. She carried a digital memory card and a key resting against her heartbeat, and she never spoke a single word about it to me. I asked Sal if he plugged the memory card into a computer. He quickly denied it. He stated he ran an honest business and respected the privacy of his customers. He simply closed the locket and placed it in his secure safe. The sheer weight of this revelation settled over me. My daughter and her husband thought they were pawning an expensive trinket to fund their luxury vacation. They had unknowingly handed over a hidden vault. A surge of protective adrenaline replaced my sorrow. I needed that pendant back in my hands immediately. I told Sal I was leaving my house that exact second. I grabbed my keys from the kitchen island. The existence of a hidden memory card made terrifying sense. Naomi had not been an ordinary corporate employee. She spent 30 years working as a senior cybersecurity analyst for a major financial institution downtown. She spent her entire career hunting digital threats, fortifying firewalls, and exposing corporate fraud. She understood the inherent vulnerability of digital systems better than anyone. She operated by a strict personal code. She trusted absolutely nothing digital unless it had a physical offline backup. When we first bought our house, she insisted on installing a heavy fireproof safe in the basement for all our vital documents. She constantly warned me that anything stored on a cloud server could be altered, stolen, or erased with a few keystrokes. The fact that she hid a memory card inside her most prized possession meant the data it contained was critical. It meant she had discovered something highly volatile and needed an absolute guarantee of its safety. She chose the one object she knew Kendra would view only as a monetary asset. My late wife had engineered a brilliant failsafe. She knew her declining health would eventually render her unable to protect herself or me. She prepared a silent countermeasure. The brass key alongside the data card confirmed she had secured physical evidence somewhere else in the city. Naomi had left a breadcrumb trail directly to me. I zipped up my jacket and walked briskly toward the garage. I pushed open the side door and hit the garage light switch. I needed to move with absolute efficiency. Before I could end the call, Sal interrupted me with a sharp warning. He told me I needed to hurry. I asked him what was wrong. Sal explained that his shop phone had rung right before I called. It was Bradley. My son-in-law had called the pawn shop in an absolute state of panic. Bradley told Sal he had made a terrible mistake. He offered to wire transfer triple the amount of cash Sal had given him just to get the necklace back immediately. Sal noted that Bradley sounded completely unhinged. The arrogant, composed man who had strutted into the shop an hour earlier was gone. Bradley had realized the true value of what he had casually sold. He must have figured out the pendant contained a hidden compartment. Sal told me Bradley had promised to be back at the shop in less than 20 minutes. The timeline was brutally tight. Bradley was rushing back to destroy whatever evidence Naomi had left behind. I thanked Sal for his honesty and promised him a substantial reward for his loyalty. I hung up the phone and shoved it into my pocket. I yanked the driver's side door of my vintage truck open. I slid behind the steering wheel and jammed the key into the ignition. The heavy engine roared to life, filling the garage with the smell of exhaust. I shifted the transmission into reverse and backed out of the driveway with tearing speed. I had to reach that pawn shop before my son-in-law did. The race had officially begun. I slammed my work boot onto the gas pedal of my 1978 Ford F-150. The vintage engine roared as I merged onto Interstate 85. The afternoon Atlanta traffic formed a dense wall of idling metal. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind shifted into the analytical precision of a structural engineer. I calculated the exact distance between the airport and Sal's pawn shop in the industrial district. Bradley undeniably had a 20-minute head start. However, he was relying on a hired town car navigating through the bottleneck of the main highway. I knew the forgotten back roads. I had spent 40 years driving these neglected streets to construction sites across the city. I veered the heavy truck off the exit ramp and cut through a trash-lined alleyway behind a row of abandoned warehouses. Every deep pothole rattled my bones. I refused to slow down. The stakes were too high. My greedy daughter and her arrogant husband thought they had outsmarted a helpless old man. They vastly underestimated my resolve. The memory of Naomi's face fueled my reckless speed. She had deliberately left a digital vault hidden inside her jewelry for a crucial reason. I was not going to let a spoiled, debt-ridden opportunist destroy her final message. I swerved around a stalled delivery van and hit a straightaway. The engine temperature gauge crept dangerously high. I ignored the red warning light. I pushed the heavy machine to its absolute structural limit. The faded brick facade of Sal's pawn shop appeared at the end of the grimy street. I slammed on the brakes and skidded into a parking space directly in front of the door. I threw the truck door open and sprinted across the cracked concrete sidewalk. I pushed violently through the heavy security door of the pawn shop. The brass bell chimed loudly in the dusty air. Sal stood behind the reinforced glass counter holding a small brown envelope in his hand. I reached deep into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. This was my strict emergency cash reserve meant for property taxes. I slammed the entire stack onto the scratched glass display case. I demanded the envelope immediately. Before Sal could even reach for the money, the front door violently banged open behind me. Bradley burst into the cramped shop. His tailored navy suit was heavily wrinkled. Perspiration poured down his flushed, panicked face. He entirely ignored my presence and lunged desperately toward the counter. He slammed his shiny platinum credit card onto the glass right next to my cash. He screamed at Sal, demanding to process a charge for 3 times the original payout. Bradley demanded the pendant back instantly. His polished facade had completely crumbled into pure desperation. I stepped directly into his line of sight, blocking the counter. Bradley froze. The color drained from his face as he realized I had beaten him to the prize. I looked my cowardly son-in-law dead in the eye. I told him he had no legal or moral right to sell my late wife's property. Bradley gritted his teeth. He shoved his manicured finger at my chest. He loudly claimed Kendra gave him the necklace and it was rightfully theirs to sell. He commanded Sal to run the credit card and ignore me. The tension in the cramped pawn shop reached an explosive boiling point. Sal looked slowly down at the shiny platinum credit card. He deliberately looked at my worn, calloused hands resting firmly on the glass counter. Sal and I had a long history strictly built on mutual respect. I had spent the last 20 years walking into this exact shop to hunt for vintage mechanical tools. We had shared countless cups of bitter coffee while complaining about rising property taxes. I was a loyal neighbor who always paid in clean cash. Bradley was just a frantic, entitled stranger trying to buy his way out of a catastrophic mistake. Sal picked up Bradley's premium credit card with 2 fingers. He flicked it forcefully right across the glass surface. The plastic card hit Bradley squarely in the chest and clattered onto the dirty linoleum floor. Sal looked at Bradley with unwavering disgust. He stated clearly that he did not do business with arrogant thieves who steal from their own families. Sal pulled my thick stack of cash toward him. He picked up the small brown envelope containing the invaluable micro SD card and the tiny brass key. He handed it directly over the counter into my waiting hand. He told me the heavy gold pendant casing was locked away in the back safe. He knew I only cared about what was hidden inside the secret compartment. I secured the envelope tightly inside my inner jacket pocket. I thanked Sal sincerely for his profound integrity. Bradley let out a visceral scream of absolute frustration. His face turned an explosive shade of crimson. He realized his darkest secret was literally walking out the front door. He had foolishly pawned the key to his own destruction, and all his credit limits combined could not buy it back. Bradley lunged forward aggressively and positioned his large frame directly in front of the shop exit. He blocked the heavy security door completely with his broad shoulders. He dropped every single pretense of being a civilized professional. He pointed a trembling, sweaty finger right at my face. He threatened to physically break my jaw if I did not hand over the envelope immediately. He loudly demanded the memory card, frantically claiming it contained highly classified financial data that absolutely did not belong to me. I did not waste a single breath arguing with a desperate coward. I am a man who spent 4 grueling decades hauling massive steel beams on brutal construction sites. I dropped my right shoulder and drove my entire body weight squarely into his soft chest. The violent impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. Bradley stumbled backward wildly, losing his footing on the slick floor. He crashed violently into a tall metal display rack of acoustic guitars, sending them crashing down. I pushed the heavy door open and marched straight out to my waiting truck. Bradley scrambled frantically to his feet and ran out onto the crowded sidewalk, screaming vile curses at my back. I climbed swiftly into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy metal door shut. I immediately hit the manual lock button just as he reached the handle. Bradley pounded his fists furiously against my reinforced glass window. I completely ignored his pathetic tantrum. I reached deep into my jacket pocket and tore open the brown envelope. The tiny black micro SD card slipped perfectly into my palm. I grabbed my digital dashboard tablet and inserted the memory card directly into the side data port. The screen flickered black for a brief second. A single video file icon popped up squarely in the center of the bright display. I pressed play without hesitation. The screen on my dashboard tablet flared with a harsh white light. The video buffered for a fraction of a second before the image sharpened perfectly. Naomi stared directly into the camera lens. My breath caught violently in my throat. She looked exactly as she had in her final agonizing weeks. Her cheekbones were sharp and gaunt, her skin severely paled by the aggressive chemotherapy treatments that ultimately failed to save her life. Yet her dark eyes burned with an intense, unyielding fury I had not witnessed since her days interrogating fraudulent tech executives. She did not waste a single breath on emotional goodbyes or tearful apologies. She spoke with a rapid, clinical precision. She stated clearly that if I was watching this recording, her heart had finally given out and she had run out of time to fix the disaster unfolding under my own roof. She took a ragged breath and delivered the crushing blow. Bradley had successfully circumvented the biometric security protocols on my primary banking portfolio. He had digitally forged my signature on a stack of heavily vetted financial documents. He utilized those falsified records to extract a massive second mortgage on my house. The sheer audacity of the crime left me paralyzed against the leather seat of my truck. Naomi explicitly detailed how Bradley bypassed the preliminary bank verifications by routing the confirmation calls directly to his untraceable personal cell phone. He had systematically transformed the solid equity of my home into hundreds of thousands of dollars in liquid cash. Outside my window, Bradley continued to slam his fists against the reinforced glass of my truck, screaming soundless threats. Inside the cab, my dead wife systematically dismantled the illusion of my secure retirement. Bradley had successfully weaponized my grief to rob me blind. Naomi leaned closer to the camera lens. Her voice dropped to a low, trembling register filled with profound, inescapable disappointment. She revealed the most agonizing truth of all. Bradley had not executed this massive financial theft alone. Kendra knew every single detail of the fraudulent mortgage from the very beginning. My own daughter had actively facilitated the massive forgery by providing Bradley with my old tax returns and confidential Social Security records. Naomi explained that Kendra demanded a hefty percentage of the stolen cash to maintain her fabricated lifestyle of luxury handbags and exotic European vacations. She willingly sacrificed my absolute financial security to fund her relentless shallow vanity. Hearing my wife expose our daughter's absolute moral bankruptcy felt like a physical blow to the ribs. Naomi coughed weakly, holding a frail hand against her chest. She explained her desperate race against time. She had meticulously compiled the digital footprint of the fraudulent transactions, including the exact IP addresses Bradley used to forge the digital signatures. She downloaded the entire encrypted dossier onto the micro SD card. She knew Kendra constantly monitored her movements in the house during her final days, waiting impatiently for her to die. Naomi chose the gold floral pendant as her secret vault because she knew Kendra viewed it only as a pawnable asset, completely blind to its true hidden function. Naomi hid the indisputable evidence right in plain sight, fully aware her failing heart could stop beating at any moment. She sacrificed her final ounces of strength to ensure I would eventually discover the devastating truth. The video glitched slightly as Naomi wiped a single tear from her hollow cheek. She stated she was leaving the absolute destruction of their deceit entirely in my capable hands. The tablet screen washed my face in a pale, cold light. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my forearms cramped painfully. I bought that 4-bedroom brick house 30 years ago. I spent 4 grueling decades climbing dangerous steel scaffolding and reviewing load-bearing blueprints in the scorching Georgia heat just to secure that specific deed. I paid off the final mortgage installment 10 years ago using a massive lump sum from my structural engineering pension. That house was my impenetrable sanctuary. I had reinforced the roof, rebuilt the foundation, and poured my physical sweat into every square inch of the property to guarantee Naomi and I would age in absolute peace. I had mistakenly believed the structure was invincible. I completely failed to account for the toxic rot festering inside my own family. Kendra grew up walking safely on the hardwood floors I installed by hand. Now she had illegally mortgaged those exact floors to finance her superficial greed. Any lingering trace of paternal affection I held for my only daughter evaporated in that cramped truck cab. The unconditional love I harbored for her transformed instantly into a cold, calculated clarity. She had looked me dead in the eye this morning and told me to take my blood pressure pills while actively plotting to leave me completely homeless on the street. I stared through the window at Bradley. He was aggressively kicking the front tire of my truck, his face distorted by a desperate, pathetic rage. He truly thought he was dealing with a grieving, senile old man. He had no idea he had just awakened a man who spent a lifetime understanding exactly how to systematically demolish a corrupt structure. The video feed stabilized for the final few seconds. Naomi stared into the lens with an unwavering, commanding intensity. She instructed me to take the tiny brass key included in the envelope directly to the First National Central Bank downtown. She stated the key belonged to a highly secure private vault she had established entirely under my name years ago. She promised the vault contained the original physical documents required to absolutely annihilate Bradley's legal standing. She told me she loved me, ordered me to show absolutely no mercy to those parasites, and abruptly cut the recording. The screen went pitch black. Silence filled the cab of the truck, completely drowning out the muffled sounds of Bradley cursing on the sidewalk. I pulled the small brass key from my jacket pocket. The cold metal pressed sharply into my palm. My counterattack was perfectly set. I reached for the ignition to start the engine and drive straight to the central bank. Suddenly, the screen of my mobile phone lit up brilliantly in the passenger seat. A high-priority fraud alert notification flashed across the display from my primary retirement account provider. A massive wire transfer of $85,000 had just been initiated. The destination was an untraceable offshore routing number. Bradley and Kendra were not just planning to steal my house, they were actively draining my liquid life savings at this exact second. The digital theft was happening right in front of my eyes. I shoved the truck into drive and slammed my heavy boot onto the accelerator. I steered the heavy truck through the darkening streets as the sky broke open. A massive, unseasonal thunderstorm slammed into Atlanta with brutal force. Sheets of rain pounded against my windshield, blurring the city lights into streaks of neon. The sudden deluge flooded the intersections and forced me to abandon my immediate route to the central bank. I turned the steering wheel and headed back to my house. The offshore wire transfer notification burned in my mind. I needed to look my daughter and son-in-law in the eyes while they thought they were winning. I pulled into the driveway and stared through the torrential rain. The black town car was parked right in front of the garage. Bradley and Kendra had not made it to Paris. I killed the engine and stepped out into the freezing downpour. I pushed the front door open. The foyer was completely chaotic. Kendra was screaming furiously into her mobile phone, demanding a full refund from an airline representative. Bradley paced the living room carpet like a caged animal. He aggressively kicked a leather ottoman and cursed the severe weather. All transatlantic flights were grounded indefinitely due to the severe lightning strikes. Their luxurious European escape was entirely ruined. They were trapped in Atlanta and completely desperate to access the stolen offshore funds. The tension in the living room was suffocating. Bradley turned his furious gaze toward me the second I walked inside. His expensive suit was soaked at the shoulders from loading luggage. His jaw clenched tight. I recognized the wild, dangerous desperation in his eyes. He had lost the pendant, missed his flight, and was hemorrhaging money. He needed a permanent solution to his financial nightmare tonight. I closed the front door and let the silence stretch between us. I stripped off my wet jacket and made a calculated tactical decision. I deliberately let my shoulders slump forward, instantly shedding the rigid posture of a man ready for war. I forced my hands to tremble slightly as I hung my coat on the brass rack. I let my eyes wander the room with a hollow, vacant expression. I completely erased the fierce clarity I had felt in the truck cab. Bradley stepped forward aggressively, his fists balled at his sides. He demanded to know where I had gone in such a terrible storm. I blinked at him slowly, forcing a look of absolute bewilderment onto my face. I raised a shaky hand to my forehead and rubbed my temples. I told him I had simply gone out to buy milk and somehow lost my way in the heavy rain. I muttered incoherently about the confusing traffic and my failing night vision. I did not mention Sal. I did not mention the pawn shop. I certainly did not mention the gold pendant or the digital vault Naomi had left behind. Kendra ended her phone call and stared at me. Her expression shifted rapidly from pure rage to calculated opportunism. She exchanged a swift, meaningful glance with Bradley. The hostility drained from their posture, replaced entirely by a sickening, predatory relief. They truly believed my mind was finally fracturing under the weight of grief and old age. I shuffled slowly toward the kitchen, leaning heavily against the wall for fabricated support. I asked Kendra if her mother was home yet. That deliberate question sealed the trap completely. Kendra smiled, a cold, victorious smile. She gently took my arm and led me to the dining table. My masterpiece of ignorance was flawlessly executed. Bradley quickly vanished down the hallway toward his temporary home office. He returned less than a minute later, holding a thick stack of freshly printed documents. His entire demeanor had shifted into a patronizing, entirely fake warmth. He pulled out a wooden chair for me and patted my shoulder with feigned affection. He laid the papers out across the polished dining table and produced an expensive fountain pen from his breast pocket. He spoke in a slow, overly articulated voice, treating me like a naive toddler. He claimed the thick documents were upgraded health insurance forms. He spun a fabricated story about a new premium coverage plan that would guarantee top-tier medical care for my declining condition. He stressed that the insurance company required my immediate signature tonight to lock in the promotional rates. He gently nudged the pen toward my resting hand. He insisted it was just standard administrative paperwork and promised to handle all the complex details for me. Kendra stood directly behind my chair, softly massaging my shoulders to maintain the illusion of a caring daughter. She whispered that this was all for my own good. She promised that signing these papers would remove every burden from my shoulders. The sheer volume of their deceit was staggering. They were utilizing my fabricated vulnerability to execute the final stage of their financial coup. Bradley tapped the signature line impatiently. He urged me to sign quickly so I could go rest in bed. I picked up the heavy fountain pen. My hand deliberately shook as I hovered the ink over the crisp white paper. I played the role of a confused elder, perfectly squinting hard at the dense paragraphs of legal jargon spread out before me. I lowered my head closer to the table, pretending my eyesight was failing me in the dim dining room light. I scanned the top margin of the first page. The bold black lettering was unmistakable. It was not a health insurance policy. The header clearly read "Petition for Conservatorship and Legal Guardianship." The structural integrity of their entire plot was laid bare on the table. Bradley and Kendra were actively petitioning a judge to declare me legally incompetent. They were attempting to strip away every single one of my fundamental rights tonight. A signature on these pages would grant Bradley absolute, uncontested control over my bank accounts, my medical decisions, and the very house I built. It would legally validate the massive offshore wire transfer they had just initiated. They intended to lock me away in a secure facility while they liquidated my life savings to pay off their mounting debts. I stared at the signature block, fully grasping the sheer magnitude of their betrayal. I did not throw the pen in their faces. I did not scream. I maintained my blank, docile expression. I slowly lowered the pen back onto the table. I let out a loud, dramatic sigh and rubbed my eyes. I mumbled that the tiny print was giving me a terrible headache. I told them my hand was cramping and I needed to sleep before signing anything. Bradley's fake smile faltered instantly. His jaw tightened in a flash of genuine panic. He reached out to force the pen back into my hand. I stood up clumsily, knocking the chair back. I told them we would finish the paperwork tomorrow morning. The battle lines were permanently drawn. I clutched the edge of the mahogany dining table and let my legs wobble just enough to scrape the wooden chair against the floor. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed the heel of my palm hard against my temple. I let out a ragged, convincing groan. I told Bradley my vision was splitting into double and the pounding in my skull was unbearable. I dropped the fountain pen directly onto the crisp legal documents. Black ink splattered across the signature line of the conservatorship petition. Bradley flinched instinctively, pulling the paperwork back to save it from the spreading stain. I mumbled a slurred apology and promised I would read and sign everything right after breakfast when my mind was clear. Kendra immediately stepped in to play the doting daughter. She grabbed my arm and guided me down the hallway toward the guest bedroom. She pulled the covers down and told me to get a good night of sleep. She closed the heavy door behind her, plunging the room into darkness. I did not lie down. I stood perfectly still by the doorframe and listened. Heavy footsteps moved rapidly toward the kitchen. The unmistakable pop of a champagne cork echoed down the corridor. Crystal glasses clinked together in a celebratory toast. Bradley let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He praised Kendra for her performance and boasted that the house would be legally theirs by tomorrow afternoon. They were drinking expensive champagne paid for by the massive, fraudulent mortgage they had just taken out in my name. They were toasting to the permanent end of my freedom. I let them enjoy their premature victory. I simply sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the house to fall completely silent. The digital clock on the bedside table flashed 2 in the morning. The entire house was dead quiet. The effects of the champagne had finally pulled Bradley and Kendra into a deep sleep. I slipped out of the room wearing dark clothes and thick, rubber-soled socks. I moved silently down the hallway toward Bradley's home office. The door was secured with a heavy-duty commercial deadbolt. Bradley always bragged about his top-tier home security system. He failed to remember that a master structural engineer understands exactly how mechanical tumblers operate. I pulled 2 small flattened steel tension wrenches from my pocket. I had fashioned them from a discarded wire hanger earlier that evening. I inserted the metal into the keyhole and applied precise, calculated pressure. The pins clicked into place one by one in under 40 seconds. The deadbolt slid back with a soft thud. I pushed the door open merely an inch. A tiny red laser blinked ominously near the baseboard. Bradley had installed a standalone infrared motion sensor pointing directly at the entrance. Breaking the beam would instantly trigger a deafening alarm. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor. I recognized the sensor model immediately. It relied on a continuous line of sight to a reflective receptor on the opposite wall. I pulled a small, highly polished pocket mirror from my jacket. I slid the mirror precisely into the narrow gap between the door and the frame. The mirror intercepted the infrared beam and reflected it perfectly back into the sensor node. The red light shifted to a steady green. I held the mirror completely steady with my left hand and army crawled through the narrow opening underneath the beam. I stood up inside the dark office. The infiltration was absolutely flawless. I approached the sleek silver laptop resting on the center of the glass desk. Bradley was an arrogant man who believed his physical locks provided absolute digital security. He had closed the laptop screen to preserve the battery, but had not bothered to log out or shut the system down. I lifted the screen. The computer woke up instantly without requiring a password. I bypassed his cluttered desktop and went straight for his local file directories. I searched for hidden spreadsheets and encrypted financial folders. I found an unconcealed file labeled with a generic home renovation title. I clicked the file open. A massive, meticulously detailed accounting ledger filled the screen. The numbers were staggering. Bradley was not a successful businessman. He was a degenerate, desperate gambler. He had documented years of catastrophic losses on offshore sports betting sites and high-stakes underground poker tables. The final tally at the bottom of the column glowed in bright red text. Bradley owed exactly $300,000 to a notoriously ruthless local organized crime syndicate. The ledger detailed aggressive interest rates compounding every single week. The impending conservatorship was never about managing my declining health or upgrading my insurance. It was a desperate, panicked survival tactic. Bradley had maxed out every credit card and taken the fraudulent second mortgage just to keep the syndicate enforcers at bay. The remaining cash from liquidating my house was his only path to clearing the massive mob debt. My daughter had completely signed away my life and my property to save her pathetic husband from having his legs broken by violent criminals. They were feeding me to the wolves to save their own skin. My jaw clenched tight in the glow of the screen. I pulled my mobile phone from my jacket pocket. I made sure the camera flash and shutter sound were completely disabled. I needed irrefutable proof of his criminal desperation. I hovered the lens over the illuminated computer screen. I systematically photographed every single page of the gambling ledger. I captured the specific dates, the massive debt totals, and the brutal interest calculations. I snapped pictures of the threatening emails Bradley had saved in a separate folder from men demanding their money by the end of the week. This digital trail was the final nail in his coffin. With this evidence combined with Naomi's hidden video, I had everything required to send them both to federal prison. I lowered my phone and tapped the screen to verify the images were perfectly legible. A sharp, distinct crack echoed in the absolute silence. The hardwood floorboards directly behind me groaned under sudden weight. My muscles seized instantly. I did not turn around immediately. I maintained my tight grip on the phone and slowly locked the screen, plunging the room back into relative darkness. The soft blue glow of the laptop monitor provided the only illumination. I turned my head by fractions of an inch. The office door was pushed wide open. The reflective pocket mirror lay uselessly on the carpet. The motion sensor alarm remained silent because it was manually deactivated from the master keypad in the hallway. Kendra stood perfectly still in the doorway. Her hair was disheveled and she wore a silk robe tightly wrapped around her waist. Her eyes were wide and fixed directly on the bright laptop screen. She looked down at my dark clothing and the phone in my hand. Her gaze locked completely onto my face. I did not freeze. I let my knees buckle entirely. I collapsed hard into Bradley's leather office chair and gasped for air. I rapidly slipped my mobile phone deep into my jacket pocket while my hand flew to my chest. I contorted my face into a mask of pure agony and deep confusion. Kendra stepped fully into the room. The suspicion in her eyes was sharp. I immediately began to hyperventilate. I stared at the blank wall past her shoulder and mumbled my late wife's name. I asked Kendra if Naomi was hiding in the closet. I let a string of drool escape the corner of my mouth. I rubbed my temples and rocked back and forth, pleading for Naomi to come back to bed. The harsh suspicion on Kendra's face melted into absolute, unadulterated disgust. She did not look at the glowing laptop screen. She did not search my pockets for a camera. She saw exactly what she wanted to see. She saw a broken, senile old man completely losing his grip on reality. She grabbed my arm roughly. Her fingernails dug painfully into my skin. She hauled me out of the chair with a frustrated groan. She dragged me down the dark hallway, complaining loudly about my pathetic mental state. She shoved me into the guest bedroom and threw the heavy blankets over my shaking body. She warned me to stay in bed or she would lock the door from the outside. She slammed the door shut, leaving me alone in the dark. My breathing leveled out instantly. My hands stopped shaking. The digital evidence of Bradley's mob debt was completely secure in my pocket. I laid completely still in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise. Dawn finally broke over the Atlanta skyline. Pale morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the guest bedroom. The house was dead silent. Bradley and Kendra were deeply unconscious, sleeping off their heavy champagne celebration. They were entirely confident their conservative petition would sail through the courts today. I threw off the heavy blankets and stood up. I dressed quickly in a crisp, tailored suit. I bypassed my work boots and laced up my formal leather Oxfords. I moved through the quiet house with the stealth of a ghost. I passed the master bedroom and heard Bradley snoring loudly. I stepped out the front door and walked down the damp driveway. The cold morning air filled my lungs. I climbed into the cab of my vintage truck and turned the key. I kept the engine idle low as I backed out into the street. I drove away from the suburban neighborhood and merged onto the highway. The morning commute was just beginning. I navigated the heavy steel truck toward the towering glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. My mind was sharp and completely focused. I gripped the steering wheel, running through the precise sequence of my counterattack. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the First National Central Bank. The concrete walls echoed with the rumble of my engine. I parked the truck and walked briskly toward the private elevator. I stepped into the polished marble lobby of the bank right as the heavy brass doors opened for the day. I bypassed the standard teller lines and walked directly toward the executive service desk. I presented my identification to the receptionist. I told her I required immediate access to the private underground vault. The senior branch manager greeted me with immediate respect. He was a tall man in a pristine charcoal suit. He personally escorted me past the armed security guards and guided me toward the heavily fortified steel elevator. We descended 3 floors below street level into the subterranean vault. The air down here was cool and clinically dry. We walked down a long corridor lined entirely with polished titanium deposit boxes. The manager stopped in front of a specific panel and inserted his master key into the primary lock. He stepped back and gestured for me to proceed. I pulled the tiny brass key from my inner jacket pocket. I slid the metal into the secondary lock and turned it smoothly. A heavy mechanical click echoed in the quiet vault. I pulled the long steel drawer from the wall and carried it to a private viewing table in the center of the room. The manager bowed his head respectfully and exited, securing the heavy glass door behind him. I was completely alone. I opened the steel lid. Inside rested a thick, sealed portfolio bound in heavy leather. Next to the portfolio lay a pristine manila envelope. I opened the envelope first. It contained the original, unredacted mortgage documents Bradley had used to leverage my house. I recognized the crude digital forgery of my signature instantly. Naomi had somehow intercepted the physical copies before the final processing phase. She had documented every fraudulent stamp and every fake notary seal. Bradley had left a glaring trail of undeniable felony fraud. I placed the forged documents carefully back into the envelope. I turned my attention to the heavy leather portfolio. This was the final piece of the puzzle Naomi had left behind. I broke the wax seal and opened the cover. The very first page of the portfolio was a certified federal patent registry. Naomi had secretly authored and patented a revolutionary data encryption algorithm in the late 90s. She licensed the software directly to massive financial institutions. The subsequent pages were detailed bank statements from a completely insulated private trust. The bottom line showed a staggering tax-free balance of $5 million. Naomi had quietly accumulated immense wealth while we lived our modest, disciplined lives. The next document was her final legally binding testament. It explicitly transferred absolute control of the $5 million trust directly to me. A specific highlighted clause followed. Naomi had legally and permanently disinherited Kendra. She cited our daughter's profound financial irresponsibility and manipulative nature as the exact legal grounds for the exclusion. Kendra had traded her mother's memory for a cheap vacation, completely unaware she was burning a $5 million bridge. I now possessed the absolute financial power to crush Bradley's pathetic mob debt and destroy his entire world. I closed the heavy leather portfolio and locked the steel box. A sharp knock on the viewing room door broke the silence. The bank manager stepped inside with a deeply troubled expression. He held a freshly printed facsimile in his shaking hand. He apologized profusely and stated we had a massive problem. He informed me that Bradley had just faxed a sworn emergency medical directive to the bank's legal department. The document falsely claimed I was suffering a severe psychotic break. Bradley was utilizing the fake conservatorship petition to execute an immediate total freeze on all my financial assets. My son-in-law was actively trying to lock me out of my own accounts while I was standing right inside the vault. The financial war had officially breached the bank walls. I instructed the panicked bank manager to delay processing the medical fax by exactly 2 hours. I cited a mandatory internal security review for sudden asset freezes on high net worth accounts. The manager nodded and locked the heavy glass door of the viewing room. I marched out of the central bank with the leather portfolio tucked firmly under my arm. The violent thunderstorm had passed, leaving the Atlanta streets slick and gleaming under the morning sun. I climbed back into my vintage truck and navigated toward the affluent commercial district in Buckhead. I pulled into the private underground garage of a towering glass skyscraper. I took the express elevator directly to the top floor. The frosted glass doors opened to the reception area of Harrington and Associates. The receptionist recognized my face instantly and bypassed the waiting room. She escorted me down a long corridor lined with modern art and dark wood paneling. I stepped into the sprawling corner office. Mr. Harrington stood behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a ruthless former federal prosecutor who had never lost a major corporate battle. He wore an immaculate charcoal pinstripe suit that projected absolute authority. I walked across the plush carpet and stood before him. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. I unzipped my jacket and began unloading my arsenal. I placed the tiny black memory card directly in the center of the polished wood. I laid out the glossy printed photographs of Bradley's illegal gambling ledger. I finally dropped the heavy leather trust portfolio next to the damning photos. Harrington did not ask a single question. He simply picked up his reading glasses and looked down at the physical proof of my daughter's ultimate betrayal. Harrington poured 2 glasses of black coffee and handed one across the desk. He owed his entire legal empire to my absolute precision. 20 years ago, Harrington was a junior prosecutor fighting a massive corporate negligence lawsuit against a corrupt construction conglomerate. A newly erected commercial parking garage had collapsed, injuring dozens of innocent people. The corporate defense attorneys actively buried the structural blueprints and blamed the tragedy on an unpredictable natural disaster. Harrington was completely outgunned and thoroughly desperate. I stepped into his office, offering my expertise entirely free of charge. I spent 3 sleepless weeks calculating the exact load-bearing failures hidden deep within the fraudulent architectural designs. I took the witness stand and systematically destroyed the corporate defense with irrefutable mathematical proof. I exposed their deliberate use of substandard steel to increase profit margins. Harrington won a landmark settlement that shattered the corrupt company and launched his career into the stratosphere. He built his prestigious firm on the unshakable foundation of my structural analysis. He viewed me not as an aging client, but as the master architect of his professional success. His loyalty to me was absolute and entirely unwavering. Harrington picked up the printed photographs of the gambling ledger and scanned the staggering debt totals. His sharp eyes narrowed as he traced the connections between the illegal syndicate and Bradley's desperate financial maneuvers. He opened the leather portfolio and read Naomi's final testament. He recognized my late wife's brilliant foresight instantly. He understood that she had engineered a flawless legal trap from the grave. Harrington set the documents down and folded his hands. He looked at me with the cold, predatory gaze of a man preparing to utterly decimate an opponent. He asked me exactly how far I wanted to escalate this war. I told Harrington I wanted Bradley completely eradicated and Kendra legally cut off from every single asset I owned. Harrington picked up the urgent medical directive Bradley had just faxed to the central bank. He studied the messy signature scrawled at the bottom of the page. A harsh, humorless laugh escaped his lips. Harrington recognized the name of the evaluating physician instantly. He informed me that Bradley had hired a disgraced, unlicensed psychiatrist named Dr. Vance. This man had been quietly expelled from the medical board 3 years ago for accepting massive cash bribes from desperate families looking to quickly lock away wealthy, inconvenient relatives. Bradley was employing a known mercenary to guarantee a diagnosis of severe dementia. Harrington explained that Bradley was forcing this rapid evaluation today to make the fraudulent conservatorship legally binding before the courts closed for the weekend. I clenched my fists, fully realizing the sheer depravity of their scheme. They intended to chemically drug me or verbally manipulate me until I appeared completely incompetent in front of a paid actor. Harrington leaned across the mahogany desk. He instructed me not to block the fake evaluation. He formulated a brilliant, aggressive counterstrike designed to weaponize Bradley's own trap against him. We would welcome the disgraced doctor into my home with open arms. We would utilize the evaluation to definitively prove my exceptional cognitive brilliance on a legally recorded medium. Harrington declared we would let Bradley dig his own grave in his own living room. Once the fake doctor submitted his fraudulent findings, Harrington would strike with a barrage of federal wire fraud and elder abuse charges. The legal snare was perfectly set. Harrington unlocked the bottom drawer of his massive desk. He reached inside and pulled out a sleek, heavy silver ink pen. He handed the instrument across the table. It looked entirely ordinary, but it felt unusually dense in my palm. Harrington explained that the pen contained a military-grade voice-activated audio recorder capable of capturing crystal-clear sound from 30 feet away. He instructed me to clip the pen securely into my front shirt pocket. Every single word spoken by Bradley Kendra and the fake doctor needed to be meticulously documented for the impending federal indictment. I clicked the top of the pen. A microscopic blue light flashed once near the clip, confirming the device was actively recording. I slipped it into my pocket and smoothed my tailored suit jacket. Harrington checked his vintage wristwatch and looked up with absolute seriousness. He told me the fraudulent psychiatrist was scheduled to arrive at my house in exactly 1 hour. Bradley and Kendra were likely waking up from their champagne-fueled celebration, expecting to find a docile, defeated old man waiting to surrender his entire life. I had a narrow 60-minute window to navigate the heavy midday Atlanta traffic and step through my front door before the mercenary doctor arrived. I reached across the mahogany desk and shook Harrington's hand with an iron grip. I turned around and walked out of the corner office. I rode the glass elevator down to the underground parking garage with a singular burning focus. I climbed back into the cab of my sturdy truck and fired up the roaring engine. I steered out into the bright city streets, fully prepared to face the parasites living under my roof. I parked my truck in the driveway and killed the heavy engine. The midday sun beat down on the windshield, yet the chill of Harrington's office remained firmly lodged in my bones. I had exactly 12 minutes before Bradley's hired mercenary arrived to declare me legally insane. I stepped through the front door and immediately felt the suffocating tension clinging to the walls of my home. The chaotic panic from the previous night had been entirely replaced by a sickening manufactured domestic tranquility. Bradley was pacing the kitchen floor with a frantic, uneven rhythm. His tie was loosened and a sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He stopped dead in his tracks the second the front door clicked shut. Kendra descended the main staircase a moment later. She had completely discarded her usual expensive designer clothes for a modest, unassuming pastel cardigan. She was actively dressing the part of a deeply burdened, devoted caregiver. She offered me a tight, sorrowful smile that made my stomach churn. She asked where I had been in a tone dripping with fabricated anxiety. I leaned heavily against the entryway wall and let out a long, exhausted sigh. I told them I had gone for a walk to clear my head but simply got turned around in the neighborhood. Bradley seized the opportunity instantly. He rushed forward and practically guided me into the kitchen, his hands gripping my shoulders with predatory enthusiasm. He guided me into a wooden chair at the island counter. He insisted that I needed to sit down and relax before my scheduled medical checkup. He turned his back to me and loudly declared he was brewing a fresh pot of dark roast coffee to help calm my fractured nerves. The trap was rapidly closing around me. I slumped forward in the wooden chair and let my chin rest against my chest. I kept my breathing shallow and erratic to maintain the illusion of a frail, disoriented old man. Bradley stood at the marble counter with his back completely turned to me. He reached into the upper cabinet and pulled down 2 identical ceramic mugs. He filled them both to the brim with steaming black coffee. He believed he was completely concealed from my line of sight. He grossly underestimated the observational awareness of a man who spent 40 years calculating structural geometry and analyzing spatial reflections. The sleek dark glass of the mounted microwave functioned as a perfect, flawless mirror. I kept my head bowed and fixed my eyes on the reflective surface. Bradley shot a quick nervous glance over his shoulder to ensure I was staring mindlessly at the floor. He quickly reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out a small plastic vial. His hands shook violently as he popped the lid. He extracted a large, translucent capsule filled with dense white powder. I recognized the distinct shape from Naomi's final days of aggressive pain management. It was a maximum-strength commercial sedative designed to induce heavy, immediate lethargy. Bradley twisted the capsule apart and tapped the chemical powder directly into the mug on the left. He grabbed a silver spoon and stirred the dark liquid rapidly to dissolve the evidence. He intended to chemically lobotomize me right here in my own kitchen. The heavy sedatives would guarantee I failed the impending psychiatric evaluation. I would be completely unable to answer the fake doctor's questions or defend my own sanity. Bradley tossed the empty plastic capsule into the garbage disposal and turned around with a bright, treacherous smile. Bradley placed the 2 identical ceramic mugs on the marble island. He deliberately slid the poisoned coffee directly toward my right hand. He picked up his own untainted mug and blew softly across the steaming surface. He spoke in a sickeningly sweet voice, urging me to drink up and find some comfort before the doctor arrived. He promised the hot caffeine would help settle my confused mind. I stared down at the dark liquid, fully aware that a single swallow would permanently end my freedom. I wrapped my fingers around the warm ceramic handle, feigning a severe tremor. Before I could lift the heavy mug to my lips, a sharp, aggressive ring echoed from the front doorbell. The sudden noise shattered the manufactured calm of the kitchen. Bradley flinched violently, sloshing hot coffee over the rim of his cup. Kendra gasped from the hallway, her high heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor as she rushed toward the foyer. The fake psychiatrist had arrived exactly on schedule. Bradley slammed his mug down on the counter right next to mine. He cursed under his breath and spun around to grab a dish towel to wipe the spilled coffee from his expensive suit pants. His focus was entirely broken for exactly 3 seconds. That was all the time I required. I did not hesitate or second-guess my movements. My hands stopped shaking instantly. With the swift, calculated precision of a man who had spent decades manipulating heavy steel girders, I reached across the marble island. I silently slid my poisoned mug to his side of the counter and pulled his clean coffee directly in front of me. The ceramic bases glided smoothly over the polished stone without making a single sound. Bradley threw the stained dish towel into the sink and let out a sharp, frustrated breath. He turned back to the kitchen island, completely oblivious to the lethal structural shift that had just occurred right under his nose. He smoothed his tie and checked his reflection in the microwave glass, desperately trying to project the image of a composed, responsible son-in-law. Kendra called out from the foyer, her voice raised in a pitch of fabricated delight as she greeted the disgraced physician. Bradley knew he needed to step into the hallway and execute his grand performance. He grabbed the mug resting on his side of the counter. His hands were still trembling from the adrenaline of his impending victory. He raised the ceramic rim to his lips and hastily chugged the dark liquid. He swallowed 3 massive gulps of the scalding coffee to clear his throat and steady his fraying nerves. I sat perfectly still and watched the heavy sedative slide directly down his throat. He slammed the empty mug onto the marble counter and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked down at me with a cold, triumphant glare, fully believing I was minutes away from being locked inside a psychiatric ward. He patted my shoulder aggressively and ordered me to stay seated. He turned on his heel and marched confidently toward the foyer to welcome the mercenary doctor into my home. He had absolutely no idea he had just swallowed his own chemical trap. I reached up and tapped the top of the silver pen clipped to my breast pocket. The microscopic blue light pulsed steadily against the fabric. I took a slow, deep breath of the rich coffee aroma and waited for the performance to begin. The heavy mahogany front door clicked shut. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, followed by the appearance of Dr. Vance. The man wore a crumpled corduroy suit and carried a scuffed leather briefcase. He reeked of stale tobacco and cheap cologne, perfectly matching Harrington's description of a disgraced, unlicensed mercenary. Bradley ushered him into the living room with a forced, overly enthusiastic gesture, offering him the armchair directly across from me. Vance did not bother with pleasantries or formal introductions. He pulled a yellow legal pad from his bag and clicked a ballpoint pen. He leaned forward, adopting a sickeningly patronizing tone reserved for small children or the severely impaired. He asked me to state my full name, my date of birth, and the current president of the United States. I sat perfectly still. I felt the comforting weight of the silver recording pen resting in my breast pocket. I let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds before I dropped the facade entirely. My posture straightened. The fabricated tremor vanished from my hands. I looked directly into Vance's bloodshot eyes. I did not just answer his rudimentary questions. I systematically dismantled his entire intellectual authority. I recited the precise date and time, followed by a flawless verbatim recitation of the Georgia State Penal Code regarding medical fraud and the illegal practice of psychiatry without a valid federal license. Vance blinked rapidly, his pen freezing midair. He attempted to pivot, asking me to perform a simple subtraction exercise to test my cognitive retention. I responded by outlining the complex multivariable calculus required to calculate the structural load-bearing capacity of a commercial suspension bridge under maximum wind shear. I detailed the tensile strength of industrial steel down to the exact decimal point. The mercenary doctor stared at me in absolute, terrified silence. The easy paycheck he had been promised was evaporating right in front of his eyes. Bradley stood near the kitchen archway, entirely oblivious to my flawless cognitive display. The massive dose of heavy industrial sedatives had finally breached his bloodstream. He attempted to step forward to interrupt my mathematical recitation, but his right leg buckled underneath him. He gripped the edge of the kitchen island to steady himself, his knuckles turning white. His face had drained of all color, taking on a sickly, translucent pallor. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He opened his mouth to issue a command to the paralyzed doctor, but the words devolved into a thick, guttural slur. His tongue was swelling, rendered completely useless by the chemical payload intended for me. He released his grip on the marble counter and tried to navigate the open floor of the living room. His equilibrium was entirely shattered. He swayed violently to the left, his expensive leather shoes catching on the edge of the Persian rug. He threw his arms out in a desperate, uncoordinated attempt to break his impending fall. His flailing hand struck a tall, heavy crystal vase resting on the side table. The glass vessel toppled over and shattered into 100 jagged pieces across the hardwood floor. The sharp, violent crash echoed through the quiet house. Bradley did not even register the noise. His knees gave out completely. He crashed face first into the carpet with a heavy, lifeless thud. He rolled onto his back, his eyes rolling up into his skull. A thick string of saliva pooled at the corner of his slack mouth and dripped onto his expensive silk tie. He let out a low, gurgling breath and descended into a deep, drug-induced stupor right in the center of the room. The architect of my destruction was completely neutralized by his own hand. The sound of shattering crystals sent Kendra sprinting down the staircase. She burst into the living room, her pastel cardigan slipping off one shoulder. She stopped dead in her tracks, surveying the absolute wreckage of her meticulously engineered plan. Her eyes darted from my composed, upright posture to the terrified, fake doctor, and finally landed on the drooling, unconscious mass of her husband, spread-eagled on the floor. Any lingering trace of the devoted, caring daughter evaporated in a flash of unadulterated fury. She completely ignored Dr. Vance's presence. She marched directly over the broken glass and stood over Bradley. She did not kneel to check his pulse. She did not ask if he was suffering a medical emergency. She unleashed a torrent of vicious, humiliating insults. She screamed at his comatose body, calling him a pathetic, useless failure. She shrieked that he could not even execute a simple, foolproof task without ruining their entire future. She kicked the sole of his shoe, demanding he wake up and fix the disaster unfolding around them. Her furious tirade echoed off the walls, brilliantly capturing the undeniable truth of their conspiracy on my hidden audio recorder. Dr. Vance watched the vicious display with mounting horror. He realized instantly that he had walked into a highly volatile, legally compromising nightmare. He was an unlicensed fraud, and the people paying him were actively self-destructing. He snapped his yellow legal pad shut and shoved it recklessly into his battered briefcase. He did not ask for his payment. He did not utter a single word of farewell. He spun on his heel and sprinted toward the front door. He yanked the brass handle open and bolted down the driveway, fleeing the property as fast as his legs could carry him. The heavy front door slammed shut, leaving the living room bathed in a tense, suffocating silence. Kendra stood over her unconscious husband, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The adrenaline of her furious outburst slowly faded, replaced by the dawning realization of what had just transpired. She slowly turned her head and looked across the room. I rose from the wooden dining chair with deliberate, unhurried grace. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit. The frail, disoriented old man she had patronized all morning was entirely gone. I looked down at my only daughter with absolute glacial coldness. I did not feel a single ounce of paternal affection. The woman standing before me was a parasite who had actively colluded to strip away my freedom and liquidate my life to pay off a criminal syndicate. I walked forward, my leather Oxfords crunching softly against the scattered shards of broken crystal. I did not alter my path. I stepped directly over Bradley's chest, treating him as nothing more than a minor obstruction on the carpet. Kendra shrank back against the wall, her eyes wide with a sudden overwhelming fear. She finally understood that she was not the predator in this house. She was the prey. I did not speak a single word to her. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my mobile phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim room. I opened my encrypted messaging application and selected Mr. Harrington's secure contact file. I typed a single, decisive command. I instructed the ruthless federal prosecutor to execute the total financial freeze and unleash the criminal indictments. I pressed send. The digital cord was permanently severed. I lowered the phone and prepared to watch their fabricated world burn to the ground. Kendra could not bear to remain inside the house for a single second longer. The suffocating humiliation of her furious outburst and the sight of her husband lying in a drooling stupor on the carpet pushed her over the edge. She refused to meet my cold, unwavering gaze. She turned on her heel and stormed out the front door, slamming the heavy mahogany wood shut behind her. She climbed into her luxury SUV and gripped the leather steering wheel with trembling, furious hands. She sped away from the suburban neighborhood, desperate to escape the disastrous collapse of her meticulously engineered plan. Retail therapy was her lifelong habitual coping mechanism for any form of stress. She drove directly to the affluent Buckhead shopping district, seeking the comforting aroma of expensive leather and polished glass to restore her fabricated sense of superiority. She walked into an exclusive designer boutique with her chin held high, projecting the arrogant entitlement of a woman who possessed unlimited wealth. She browsed the pristine displays and quickly selected a pair of imported Italian stilettos she absolutely did not need. She approached the marble checkout counter with a condescending smile. She slid her heavy platinum credit card across the glass, fully expecting the soothing rush of a massive transaction to validate her status and erase the morning's colossal failure. The cashier inserted the heavy platinum card into the digital reader. A sharp negative tone emitted from the machine. The terminal screen flashed a bright, glaring red. The cashier maintained a polite, professional smile, attempting the transaction a second time before quietly informing Kendra that the card had been officially declined. Kendra snatched the plastic back, her face flushing with immediate indignant rage. She loudly blamed a bank error or a restrictive fraud alert triggered by the high purchase amount. She pulled her mobile phone from her designer handbag and logged directly into her primary banking application, fully intending to override the security block and humiliate the cashier. The application loaded, and her arrogant scowl vanished instantly. The digital interface displayed a cascading list of aggressive red zeros. Every single joint account tied to my name, every shared line of credit she had ruthlessly exploited, and the primary savings pool had been legally and permanently severed. Mr. Harrington had executed the financial strike with devastating surgical efficiency. The funds were entirely locked down and routed far beyond her reach. She stared at the empty balance on the glowing screen. The cold, suffocating reality of her absolute financial ruin washed over her right in the middle of the high-end boutique. The cashier softly asked if she possessed another form of payment, but Kendra had absolutely nothing left to give. Kendra stumbled out of the boutique completely empty-handed. The bright midday sun felt blinding and oppressive as genuine panic set in. She had never held a legitimate paying job for a single day in her entire adult life. For over a decade, she had funded her lavish lifestyle by systematically siphoning money from Naomi and me. She had orchestrated a relentless series of fabricated entrepreneurial ventures to drain our savings. She constantly requested massive seed money for a boutique marketing firm, demanded capital for a non-existent organic skincare line, and secured heavy investments for a luxury event planning company that never hosted a single client. Every single dollar we provided to support her supposed independence went directly toward funding her designer wardrobes, luxury cars, and exotic European vacations. She operated under the absolute delusion that the bank of her parents would remain open indefinitely. She viewed my hard-earned structural engineering pension as her personal inheritance, shamelessly withdrawing it decades early. Naomi had seen through the continuous lies, first resulting in the secret federal trust and the airtight legal disinheritance. Now I had slammed the vault permanently shut. The free ride was completely over. She stood on the hot concrete sidewalk with no employable skills, no incoming revenue, and zero access to the wealth she felt entitled to claim. Back at the house, the heavy industrial sedatives slowly began to release their grip on Bradley's central nervous system. He let out a low, ragged groan and rolled onto his side. He woke up face down on the living room carpet, surrounded by the sharp, scattered shards of the shattered crystal vase. A massive, throbbing headache pounded violently against the inside of his skull. His mouth tasted like dry ash, and his vision remained heavily blurred. He struggled to push himself up onto his hands and knees, completely disoriented and lacking any clear memory of how the psychiatric evaluation had failed so spectacularly. He dragged himself toward the base of the sofa, leaning his weight against the cushions. Before he could fully process the empty living room or realize his wife had abandoned him, his mobile phone began to ring violently inside his rumpled suit pocket. The harsh, aggressive vibration jarred his fractured senses. He fumbled clumsily for the device and squinted at the bright, glaring screen. The caller ID did not display a name, only a localized number he recognized with pure, unadulterated terror. It was the ruthless local gambling syndicate. He answered the phone with a dry, cracking voice, fully expecting a demand for the $300,000. A cold, gravelly tone on the other end did not ask for the money. The enforcer simply instructed Bradley to look out the front window. The debt collectors were currently parked in a black sedan at the exact end of the driveway, waiting patiently to collect what they were owed. Bradley dragged his heavy, uncoordinated limbs toward the front window and peered through the blinds. The sleek black sedan idled at the very edge of the driveway. The heavy engine rumbled with a low, menacing vibration that rattled the glass pane. The car doors swung open in perfect, terrifying unison. 3 massive men stepped out onto the damp concrete. They moved with the synchronized precision of professional predators. They wore dark, tailored suits stretched tight over thick, muscular frames. They did not rush. They walked up the driveway with absolute, intimidating confidence. Bradley stumbled backward, his breath catching painfully in his throat. He tried to lock the deadbolt, but his hands shook too violently to grasp the brass knob. The lead enforcer did not bother knocking. He raised a heavy leather boot and kicked the mahogany front door with shattering force. The wooden frame splintered instantly. The lock snapped and the door slammed inward, rebounding violently against the foyer wall. The 3 men stepped inside the house, instantly shrinking the spacious entryway with their sheer physical bulk. The lead enforcer reached out and grabbed Bradley by the collar of his ruined dress shirt. He slammed Bradley hard against the plaster wall, knocking the remaining breath from his lungs. The enforcer did not raise his voice. He spoke in a cold, deadly whisper that carried more threat than a scream. He demanded the $300,000 immediately. He made it explicitly clear that the time for delays, excuses, and fabricated wire transfers was entirely over. He pressed a thick forearm against Bradley's windpipe, cutting off his oxygen supply. The syndicate had arrived to collect their debt, and they intended to leave with either a massive pile of cash or Bradley's life. Bradley gasped desperately for air, clawing at the thick forearm, crushing his windpipe. The enforcer loosened his grip just a fraction of an inch, allowing Bradley to slide down the wall and collapse onto the hardwood floor. Bradley scrambled backward like a cornered rat, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. He begged for his life, his voice pitching into a pathetic high wail. He frantically pointed a trembling finger toward the attached garage. He babbled wildly about my prized vintage truck parked inside. He promised the vehicle was fully restored, a classic model easily worth tens of thousands of dollars on the immediate resale market. He crawled toward the kitchen counter, desperately grabbing a ring of spare keys. He thrust them toward the lead enforcer, practically begging the man to take the vehicle as a preliminary down payment. The enforcer stared down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Bradley did not stop there. He rapidly promised the entire house. He swore the property was completely paid off and possessed immense equity. He claimed he held the legal authority to sign over the deed today. He offered to draft a rapid bill of sale right there in the foyer, promising to transfer every ounce of value on the property directly to the syndicate. He was actively attempting to trade the absolute entirety of my life savings and my physical sanctuary to spare himself a violent beating. He threw my legacy under the bus without a single second of hesitation. The lead enforcer took the spare keys from Bradley's shaking palm. He weighed the metal in his hand, considering the offer. He looked toward the garage door, calculating the immediate liquidation value of the vintage truck. I stepped out of the shadowy corridor and walked directly into the center of the shattered foyer. I wore my crisp, tailored suit, standing tall and utterly unbothered by the sudden home invasion. My posture projected total, unwavering authority. I held a thick, heavily sealed legal folder in my right hand. I did not look at Bradley groveling on the floor. I locked my eyes directly onto the lead enforcer. I spoke in a calm, resonating baritone that commanded immediate attention. I informed the three men that every single asset on this property, including the vintage truck in the garage and the very floorboards beneath their feet, belonged exclusively to a federally protected trust. I raised the certified documents provided by Mr. Harrington and tapped the embossed federal seal on the cover. I explicitly laid out the legal reality of their current situation. I explained that any unauthorized seizure of the truck would not be treated as a simple debt collection. It would be instantly classified as federal grand larceny against a protected estate. I warned them that driving that vehicle off my driveway would invite an immediate overwhelming response from a dedicated FBI task force. I told them my legal counsel was a ruthless former federal prosecutor who actively monitored the estate matrix. I made it absolutely clear that Bradley possessed zero equity, zero legal authority, and zero assets to his name. The miserable man bleeding on the floor was completely bankrupt and legally paralyzed. I held the documents out, inviting the lead enforcer to verify the structural integrity of my legal fortress. I stood my ground, transforming their easy collection job into a massive, untouchable federal liability. The lead enforcer snatched the heavy folder from my hand. His dark eyes rapidly scanned the crisp legal text and the undeniable federal certification stamps. He possessed enough street-level intelligence to recognize a genuine legal trap when he saw one. He understood instantly that tangling with a protected federal trust would bring down heat his syndicate simply could not afford. The enforcer snapped the folder shut and tossed it onto the entryway table. He turned his attention back to the pathetic, shivering man curled up on the floor. He raised his hand and threw the spare truck keys directly into Bradley's face. The heavy brass caught Bradley sharply on the cheekbone, leaving an instant red welt. The enforcer leaned over his massive frame, casting a dark shadow over Bradley's cowering body. He delivered his final non-negotiable ultimatum. He gave Bradley exactly 24 hours to produce the $300,000 in hard cash. If the money was not secured by tomorrow morning, the syndicate would return to brutally shatter both of his legs before stripping him down to the bone. The enforcer did not wait for a response. He turned on his heel and marched out the shattered front door, his two silent associates following closely behind. The sleek black sedan reversed out of the driveway and vanished down the street. Bradley remained curled on the floor, trembling violently, as the sheer reality of his impending death sentence settled into his fractured mind. He clutched his bruised face and let out a frantic, high-pitched scream. He bellowed for Kendra at the top of his lungs. He demanded his wife return home immediately, completely desperate to execute their final unthinkable measure. Kendra's luxury SUV careened into the driveway just minutes after the syndicate sedan disappeared. Her tires squealed aggressively against the pavement as she slammed the transmission into park. She leaped from the vehicle, her face a mask of absolute frantic desperation. The humiliation of her publicly declined platinum card had entirely shattered her fabricated reality. Her entire adult life had been bankrolled by an endless stream of my money, and encountering a hard, unyielding denial broke her completely. She stormed up the walkway and froze at the threshold. The shattered mahogany front door hung precariously from its broken hinges. Bradley remained curled on the foyer floor, weeping uncontrollably and clutching his bruised cheekbone. He babbled wildly about the massive enforcers, the 24-hour deadline, and the immediate threat to his life. Kendra did not offer him a single word of comfort. The imminent threat of physical violence simply fueled her aggressive survival instinct. She marched past her weeping husband and headed directly into the kitchen. I stood motionless by the marble island, observing the chaotic collapse of their domestic illusion. Kendra reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a thick, heavily folded document. Her hands shook violently as she slapped the paperwork down onto the polished stone counter. She glared at me with feral, unhinged entitlement. She announced she had just uncovered Naomi's true final testament. She claimed my late wife had secretly drafted a revised will right before her passing. Kendra insisted this new document superseded every single trust protocol I had just established. She had clearly planned this contingency with Bradley for weeks, holding the fraudulent paperwork in reserve for a moment of absolute desperation. The mob threat had forced her to play her final desperate hand. Kendra slammed her palm against the forged paperwork. Her voice echoed off the kitchen walls in a shrill, demanding pitch. She aggressively asserted that the document explicitly transferred sole ownership of the entire estate directly to her. She claimed the house, the vintage truck, and all remaining financial accounts were legally her exclusive property. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the hallway and ordered me to pack my belongings immediately. She demanded I vacate the premises before the sun went down. She threatened to dial emergency services and have armed police officers forcibly drag me out of the house for criminal trespassing. She painted a vivid, cruel picture of me being thrown onto the street like a discarded vagrant. Bradley dragged himself up from the foyer floor and stumbled into the kitchen to stand behind his wife. He wiped the blood from his cheek and nodded eagerly along with her aggressive demands. The $300,000 bounty hanging over his head erased any semblance of humanity he had left. He desperately needed the house to belong to Kendra so he could instantly liquidate the property to satisfy the syndicate. He demanded I hand over the keys to the truck on my way out the door. They stood side by side, projecting a pathetic, unified front of total delusion. They truly believed this piece of paper was their ultimate salvation. They thought they had finally outmaneuvered me and cornered me into submission. They demanded I surrender my sanctuary and walk away into the abyss with absolutely nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue the legal validity of the trust against her sudden discovery. I simply reached across the marble island and picked up the folded document. The paper felt heavy and crisp, fresh from a high-quality printer. I slowly read the dense legal jargon detailing the complete transfer of my life savings to my treacherous daughter. My eyes naturally drifted to the bottom of the final page. I stared at the signature block. A sudden, profound sense of victory washed over my entire body. My late wife possessed a highly unique, deeply traditional family middle name. Naomi thoroughly despised it and almost never used it in daily life, but it was legally required on every binding document she ever signed. The disgraced black market forger Bradley hired had made a catastrophic, undeniable error. The letters jumped off the page, an amateurish mistake that insulted Naomi's memory as much as it secured my victory. He had misspelled Naomi's middle name by a single, glaring consonant. It was a fatal flaw that transformed a simple civil dispute into a massive, heavily documented federal crime. I looked up from the paper and let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I did not point out the spelling error. I did not correct their delusion. I calmly nodded my head and accepted her eviction terms. I turned my back on them and walked steadily down the hall to the master bedroom. I pulled a sturdy canvas duffel bag from the closet and packed 3 changes of clothes, my shaving kit, and the original photographs of my late wife. I slung the heavy strap over my shoulder and walked back out to the foyer. Bradley watched me approach the shattered front door with wide, terrified eyes. My absolute silence and the calm smile resting on my face sent a massive chill directly down his spine. He expected me to fight to scream or to beg for a compromise. My total willingness to abandon a multi-million-dollar estate without a single word of protest terrified him far more than the syndicate enforcers. He realized in that agonizing moment that I was not retreating. I was stepping back to watch the bomb detonate. I walked out into the humid Atlanta air and stepped into the garage. I fired up the heavy engine of my vintage truck and backed slowly down the driveway, leaving them trapped inside the house with a ticking 24-hour death clock. The roar of the engine masked the sound of Bradley's panicked shouting from the porch. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic and drove directly back to the towering glass skyscraper in Buckhead. I took the express elevator straight to the top floor and marched unannounced into Harrington's sprawling corner office. The ruthless former prosecutor looked up from his mahogany desk. I unzipped my jacket and dropped the forged will directly onto his polished blotter. I pointed a steady finger at the misspelled signature block at the bottom of the page. Harrington leaned forward and examined the ink. A dark, predatory grin instantly matched my own. He grabbed his desk phone and initiated a secure conference call. We scanned the fraudulent document and dispatched the high-resolution file directly to a federal judge. The final steel jaws of our legal trap slammed permanently shut. The digital clock on the dashboard of Kendra's luxury SUV shifted to 9 in the morning. The 24-hour deadline set by the syndicate enforcers was rapidly evaporating. Bradley sat in the passenger seat, his bruised cheekbone throbbing in rhythm with his erratic heartbeat. He clutched the forged will inside a thick manila folder as if it were a physical shield against the impending violence. Kendra navigated the busy morning Atlanta traffic with reckless aggression, running a red light to reach the Central Bank Plaza. They possessed absolutely no liquid cash, and their only remaining strategy was to illegally leverage my estate. They pulled into the bank parking lot and practically sprinted through the heavy glass double doors. Bradley marched directly to the premier client desk, his dress shirt severely wrinkled and his hands trembling violently. He slapped the fraudulent testament onto the polished marble counter. He glared at the young woman behind the glass, projecting an aura of wealthy indignation. He demanded immediate service from the startled teller. He aggressively explained that his father-in-law was severely incapacitated and that his late mother-in-law had left the entire estate to his wife. He requested a rapid emergency equity loan against the property. He commanded the teller to initiate a direct wire transfer of exactly $300,000 to a specified offshore routing number to settle an urgent family debt. He leaned over the counter, sweating profusely, insisting that the paperwork was entirely legal and that the transaction required absolute priority. He believed his sheer aggressive momentum would bulldoze the teller into bypassing standard verification protocols. He severely underestimated the invisible net Harrington and I had already cast over his every financial move. The teller picked up the forged document, her eyes scanning the misspelled signature, and quietly asked them to wait for a brief moment. The teller did not argue or question the highly suspicious nature of the sudden offshore wire request. She maintained a polite, practiced smile and carried the manila folder directly to the glass-walled office at the rear of the bank. The branch manager was a meticulous financial officer who had received a highly classified briefing from Harrington less than 12 hours prior. He had been explicitly instructed on exactly how to handle Bradley and Kendra the moment they attempted to liquidate my assets. The manager emerged from his office with a welcoming, accommodating expression perfectly designed to disarm panicked criminals. He approached the front desk and warmly shook Bradley's trembling hand. He congratulated Kendra on her newly acquired estate and apologized profusely for the minor administrative hurdles associated with processing such a massive expedited loan. He gracefully escorted them away from the public lobby and guided them down a quiet, carpeted hallway. He opened the solid oak door to a private VIP suite equipped with plush leather seating and a heavy mahogany conference table. The manager invited them to sit and make themselves entirely comfortable. He poured 2 cups of premium dark roast coffee from a silver carafe, sliding the steaming porcelain mugs across the polished wood. He explained that a $300,000 equity loan required a few manual overrides in their primary computer system. He assured them the wire transfer was moving forward but requested their patience while he personally verified the final routing numbers. He spoke in a soothing, hypnotic cadence, skillfully draining the frantic urgency from the room. He effectively trapped them in a comfortable, luxurious holding cell under the guise of exceptional customer service. Bradley took a desperate gulp of the hot coffee, completely unaware that every passing second tightened the federal snare around his neck. The branch manager left the VIP suite and quietly closed the oak door, leaving Bradley and Kendra to bask in their fabricated victory. They had no idea they had just crossed a devastating legal threshold. Presenting a fraudulent will in a private living room constituted a serious civil offense. Submitting that exact same forged document to a federally insured bank to secure a massive cash loan instantly escalated the crime to an entirely new dimension. Bradley was not merely attempting to steal my house. He was actively attempting to execute a $300,000 transaction to an out-of-state syndicate account. Engaging in interstate wire fraud using falsified legal documents automatically triggered a severe federal felony classification. The moment Bradley demanded the electronic transfer, he removed his fate from local civil courts and placed his life directly into the crushing grip of the federal justice system. His absolute desperation to appease the violent debt collectors blinded him to the catastrophic legal exposure he was creating. He had ignored every rational boundary fueled by a toxic combination of massive gambling debts and a profound sense of arrogant entitlement. Kendra was equally culpable, sitting beside him as a willing co-conspirator, actively leveraging her late mother's forged signature to secure her own financial salvation. They had operated for years under the assumption that they could manipulate the system and exploit my wealth without ever facing a tangible consequence. They believed their white-collar status provided an invisible shield against severe prosecution. They failed to realize that Harrington had deliberately left the bank avenue open for them to exploit. We needed them to commit a crime so undeniable and heavily documented that no defense attorney could ever unravel it. Bradley's unchecked greed had officially pushed him past the point of no return. The oak door swung open, and the branch manager returned to the VIP suite carrying a stack of pristine laser-printed documents. He took his seat at the head of the mahogany table and spread the paperwork out in front of Bradley and Kendra. He presented the final loan authorization agreements and the specific wire transfer execution forms. He pointed a sleek silver pen at the small dotted lines located at the bottom of the pages. He calmly informed them that their signatures were the only remaining requirement to instantly route the $300,000 to their designated account. Bradley did not hesitate to review the binding federal clauses or question the heavily standardized language. He snatched the silver pen from the manager's hand and rapidly scrawled his signature across the paper. Kendra eagerly followed suit, signing her name with an arrogant, triumphant flourish. They fully believed they had secured their freedom and effectively conquered my estate. Bradley slammed the heavy pen down onto the polished wood with a sharp, aggressive thud. He leaned across the table and demanded the official transfer receipt, insisting that his associates required immediate digital proof of the transaction. He wiped a fresh bead of sweat from his bruised cheek, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate anticipation. The branch manager carefully gathered the signed documents and tapped the edges against the table to align them perfectly. He offered Bradley a cold, polite smile that completely lacked any professional warmth. He did not hand over a confirmation receipt or assure them the funds were processed. Instead, the manager reached under the thick edge of the mahogany table and firmly pressed the concealed silent alarm button. A silent electronic signal shot directly to the waiting federal agents, confirming that the trap was successfully triggered. The branch manager smiled politely, keeping his hands resting flat on the heavy mahogany table. Bradley tapped his leather shoe against the carpet, his anxiety rising with every passing second. He demanded to know what was taking so long. The manager smoothly explained that federal regulations required a secondary authorization for out-of-state wires exceeding $250,000. Before Bradley could erupt into another panicked tirade, the heavy oak door swung open. It was not a bank teller carrying a transaction receipt. Two uniformed court bailiffs stepped into the VIP suite, their presence instantly draining the remaining oxygen from the room. The lead bailiff approached the table and dropped a thick manila envelope directly over the forged will. He loudly announced that Bradley and Kendra were officially served. Bradley stared at the court summons in absolute horror. He had filed a preliminary conservatorship petition just yesterday morning, assuming the bloated legal system would take weeks to process the paperwork. He intended to use that judicial buffer to secure the syndicate cash. He had no idea Harrington had actively intercepted the filing and weaponized his extensive judicial connections to force an immediate emergency hearing. The bailiff stated they were commanded to appear at the Fulton County Family Court within the hour. Failure to comply would result in immediate bench warrants for their arrest. Kendra shrank back into her leather chair, her face entirely devoid of color. The bank manager quietly slid the fraudulent will into his own briefcase, stating the bank would hold the document pending federal review. The syndicate debt collectors were counting down their 24-hour deadline outside, and Bradley was now forcibly dragged into a courtroom. The financial artery was completely severed, trapping them in a nightmare entirely of their own making. The heavy double doors of courtroom 4B swung shut, sealing Bradley and Kendra inside the sprawling judicial chamber. Bradley had hastily retained a slick, aggressive defense attorney known for bullying vulnerable seniors into submission. The attorney immediately took the floor, pacing before the judge with practiced theatricality. He launched into a vicious, highly calculated character assassination. He painted a tragic, fabricated portrait of a once brilliant structural engineer who had completely lost his grip on reality following his wife's death. The lawyer claimed I was actively wandering the streets, suffering from severe paranoid delusions and inexplicably abandoning a multi-million-dollar estate. He pointed aggressively toward my side of the aisle, declaring me an immediate danger to myself and the public. Kendra seized her cue with flawless precision. She buried her face in her hands and let out a series of perfectly timed, trembling sobs. She approached the judge's bench and begged the court to intervene before her beloved father hurt himself. She pleaded for the legal authority to manage my life, my health care, and my assets, framing her hostile takeover as an act of profound daughterly devotion. She claimed the sudden bank transfer they attempted was simply an emergency measure to secure my medical care. She leveraged every ounce of her lifelong training and manipulation to sell the performance. She had spent the last decade using these exact tears to extract funding for her failed business ventures, fully relying on the assumption that authority figures would always pity a weeping daughter. Bradley stood beside her, nodding with manufactured solemnity. He constantly checked his wristwatch, sweating profusely as the mob's deadline ticked closer. They laid all their cards on the table, betting their entire survival on the judge believing their intricate web of lies. I sat completely motionless beside Mr. Harrington at the respondents' table. I wore an immaculate charcoal-tailored suit projecting the unshakable composure of a man who had spent 40 years constructing unbreakable foundations. I did not slouch, I did not fidget, and I did not offer a single emotional reaction to the barrage of vicious lies echoing through the courtroom. My absolute silence fundamentally unnerved Bradley's defense attorney. He had built his entire legal strategy on the expectation that an elderly man accused of severe dementia would eventually lose his temper, shout interruptions, or demonstrate visible confusion. He actively attempted to provoke me. He raised his voice, leaned directly over our table, and asked insulting, rudimentary questions designed to trigger a defensive outburst. I refused to grant him even a flinch of acknowledgement. I stared straight ahead with glacial detachment, treating the aggressive lawyer with the same indifference I would afford a buzzing insect. The calculated silence resonated louder than any screaming denial. The judge, a seasoned magistrate with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, began to narrow her eyes at the defense's increasingly desperate antics. Kendra's manufactured weeping slowly tapered off as she realized her performance was striking a solid, impenetrable wall. She looked across the aisle, expecting to see a broken, defeated father ready to surrender his autonomy. Instead, she met my cold, predatory gaze. The sheer intensity of my composure sent a visible tremor down her spine. Bradley shifted his weight from foot to foot, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. He realized with mounting terror that my silence was not a symptom of cognitive decline. It was the supreme confidence of an architect watching his enemies willingly walk directly into the center of a perfectly designed demolition zone. The judge raised her wooden gavel and struck the sound block with a sharp, decisive crack. She ordered the defense attorney to cease his badgering and return to his designated seat. She adjusted her glasses and turned her piercing gaze toward our side of the courtroom. She formally addressed Mr. Harrington, asking if the defense had any response to the severe allegations of mental incompetence and financial instability presented by the petitioners. Harrington did not rush. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate, agonizing slowness and stood tall before the bench. He possessed the terrifying calm of an apex predator preparing to execute a fatal strike. He thanked the court for its time and stated that he would not waste a single second attempting to verbally refute the petitioner's claims. He firmly declared that words were entirely unnecessary when absolute proof was readily available. Harrington reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a sleek, heavy silver ink pen. He held the military-grade audio recorder up so the judge, the defense attorney, and the panicked petitioners could see it clearly. The microscopic blue light near the clip was currently disabled, but its purpose was instantly unmistakable. Bradley's face drained of all remaining color as he recognized the metallic instrument I had worn in my breast pocket during the disastrous psychiatric evaluation in my kitchen. Harrington turned toward the court clerk and requested immediate permission to submit a single piece of digital evidence to the courtroom's central audiovisual projector. He promised the judge that this specific recording would not only verify my exceptional cognitive brilliance, but would also comprehensively dismantle the entire criminal conspiracy unfolding before her very eyes. Harrington connected the silver device to the digital terminal and prepared to broadcast their ultimate ruin. Mr. Harrington tapped a series of precise commands into the digital terminal resting on our table. The heavy fluorescent lights suspended above the sprawling courtroom automatically dimmed, casting the judicial chamber into a tense, cinematic twilight. A massive white projection screen descended slowly from the ceiling directly behind the judge's elevated bench. Harrington did not play the audio from the silver pen just yet. He had securely loaded the contents of the tiny black memory card I had provided him earlier in his office. A high-definition video flickered to life on the massive screen, instantly dominating the silent room. My late wife Naomi appeared in vivid, undeniable clarity. She sat in the very same leather armchair where Bradley had later attempted to chemically drug me. She looked physically frail, but her dark eyes burned with an intense, intimidating sharpness. She looked directly into the camera lens and spoke with absolute commanding authority. She stated her full legal name, her precise date of birth, and declared herself to be of completely sound mind and body. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. Naomi did not waste a single second on sentimentality or sorrow. She explicitly addressed the camera and laid out the exact parameters of the criminal conspiracy she had meticulously uncovered before her death. She methodically detailed Bradley's escalating, highly dangerous gambling debts and his desperate interactions with the violent local syndicate. She exposed Kendra's insatiable greed and her absolute refusal to secure legitimate, sustained employment. Naomi stared straight through the digital projection and declared that she fully anticipated her daughter and son-in-law would eventually attempt to fabricate a fraudulent will to steal my assets. She systematically outlined the exact legal parameters of the forged document they had undoubtedly just submitted to the court. She even noted the specific middle name the amateur forger would inevitably misspell, completely neutralizing their entire foundational claim. Her voice echoed through the silent chamber with the undeniable, crushing weight of absolute truth. The video seamlessly transitioned from Naomi's face to a highly detailed, undeniable presentation of immutable financial data. High-resolution scans of offshore bank statements, hidden routing numbers, and certified investment portfolios flashed across the massive screen in rapid succession. Naomi's voice continued as a steady voiceover narrating the undeniable proof of a $5 million federal trust she had secretly established entirely outside the reach of local probate courts. She meticulously tracked every single illicit withdrawal Kendra had attempted over the past 5 years, completely destroying the fabricated illusion of my daughter as a responsible, caring family member. Naomi projected the original unadulterated property deed, proving unequivocally that the house, the vintage truck, and the surrounding land belonged solely to the federally protected trust. She left absolutely zero room for legal maneuvering loopholes or alternative interpretations. The final document appeared on the screen bearing the legitimate, perfectly spelled signatures of 3 independent federal witnesses. It was her true and final testament. Naomi read the binding clauses out loud, her voice echoing with a cold, unrelenting finality. She explicitly and permanently revoked every single cent of Kendra's potential inheritance. She legally declared her only daughter entirely unfit to manage any portion of the family estate or make any medical decisions on my behalf. In the very next sentence, she granted me absolute unchecked executive power over the entire $5 million trust and all associated physical properties. She legally barred Bradley and Kendra from ever stepping foot on the premises or contesting the financial structure in any jurisdiction. Naomi had anticipated their ultimate betrayal and engineered a flawless, impenetrable legal vault from the grave. The presentation concluded with her face returning to the screen for one final, lingering moment. She looked out at the courtroom and firmly stated that any individual attempting to declare me mentally incompetent was actively engaging in a hostile criminal fraud. The massive screen abruptly faded to black. The courtroom plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. The sheer magnitude of the digital evidence hung in the air like a crushing physical weight. No one dared to speak. No one dared to even breathe too loudly. Bradley's high-priced defense attorney stood absolutely frozen at his wooden desk. He stared at the blank projection screen, his mind rapidly calculating the catastrophic legal fallout of the past 10 minutes. He was a ruthless, aggressive bully in family court, but he possessed enough survival instinct to recognize a massive federal felony when it hit him squarely in the face. He looked down at the forged documents he had just confidently submitted into the official court record. He realized instantly that his clients had actively weaponized his law license to commit severe wire fraud against a federally protected estate. He dropped his expensive fountain pen onto the wooden desk with a sharp, echoing clatter. He physically took 3 distinct steps backward, deliberately and visibly distancing himself from Bradley and Kendra. He completely abandoned his clients in front of the judge to save his own career. Kendra's manufactured, perfectly timed tears dried up instantly. Her face turned a sickly, translucent shade of white. She wiped at her dry cheeks with a trembling hand, her jaw hanging slack as the illusion of her guaranteed wealth evaporated into thin air. She looked around the room, desperately searching for a sympathetic face, but found only expressions of absolute, unshielded disgust. Bradley remained entirely paralyzed in his chair. He did not blink. He did not move a single muscle. He stared blankly at the dark projection screen, fully comprehending the sheer totality of his utter defeat. He had absolutely no money, no legal standing, no protective lawyer, and no defense. His mind violently snapped back to the black sedan idling at the end of my driveway. He realized with a chilling, primal terror that his life was completely and entirely forfeit. The seasoned judge stared down from the high wooden bench. Her face was a rigid mask of cold, unadulterated fury. She had presided over family court for 2 decades, and possessed zero tolerance for arrogant individuals who weaponized her courtroom to execute criminal conspiracies. She raised her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sound block with a deafening, violent crack. The sharp noise shattered the lingering silence and jolted Bradley out of his paralyzed stupor. The judge spoke with a booming, authoritative voice that demanded absolute submission. She formally dismissed the conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice, permanently barring Bradley and Kendra from ever filing another claim against my person or my estate. She did not stop there. She pointed a firm accusatory finger directly at the petitioner's table. She loudly ordered the two uniformed court bailiffs to immediately lock and seal the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom. She declared that absolutely no one was permitted to leave the chamber under penalty of contempt. The judge turned her attention to the frantic court clerk and issued a series of rapid, devastating commands. She ordered the immediate impoundment of the forged will, the false medical evaluations, and the comprehensive digital evidence provided by Mr. Harrington. She officially stated that the severity of the interstate wire fraud and the calculated federal forgery entirely exceeded the jurisdiction of a local family court. She announced she was referring the entire matter along with all associated physical evidence directly to the United States Department of Justice for immediate criminal prosecution. Bradley let out a low, whimpering gasp as the bailiffs positioned themselves firmly in front of the locked exit, their hands resting on their duty belts. The federal trap had securely closed around them, leaving absolutely no avenue for escape. The heavy finality of the judge's ruling shattered the paralyzing spell holding Bradley captive. The magistrate formally dismissed the family court proceedings, explicitly stating her jurisdiction had ended, and the matter now belonged entirely to the federal authorities. The bailiff stepped aside from the heavy oak doors, instructed to let the petitioners leave the local courtroom so they could walk directly into the waiting hands of federal law enforcement. Bradley saw this procedural transition as a narrow, desperately fleeting window for escape. He violently shoved his heavy wooden chair back, the legs screeching sharply against the polished floorboards. He did not look at the judge, his defense attorney, or the bewildered gallery. He bolted toward the courtroom exit in a state of absolute blind panic. His polished leather shoes slipped frantically against the marble hallway as he sprinted toward the main elevators. He possessed no liquid assets, no legal protection, and a ticking death clock from a violent syndicate. Flight was his only remaining instinct. Kendra scrambled out of her seat and chased after him, her expensive heels clacking wildly through the judicial corridors. She caught up to him just as he reached the lobby, grabbing the fabric of his tailored suit jacket and yanking him backward. Her face was contorted in sheer terror as she screamed at him, demanding a solution. She demanded to know how they were going to pay the enforcers and how they were going to avoid federal prison. She clawed at his lapels, shrieking for a plan, completely unwilling to accept that her endless stream of unearned wealth had violently evaporated. Bradley ripped his jacket from her manicured grip, his chest heaving with erratic, shallow breaths. He offered no reassurances. He simply turned and sprinted toward the blinding sunlight pouring through the courthouse's main glass vestibule, desperate to reach their vehicle. Bradley and Kendra burst through the heavy glass doors and stumbled out into the oppressive heat of the Atlanta afternoon. They rushed down the wide concrete steps, entirely focused on reaching the luxury SUV parked in the adjacent visitor lot. Bradley fumbled wildly in his pockets for his electronic key fob, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. He hit the unlock button, the vehicle chirping in response, offering a momentary, pathetic illusion of safety. Before he could even reach the driver's side door handle, the screech of heavy tires tore through the parking lot. Two matte black, heavily armored SUVs surged forward from opposite directions. The massive vehicles accelerated with terrifying precision, aggressively boxing in Kendra's luxury car and completely blocking their path to the exit. The doors of the black vehicles flew open simultaneously. A coordinated swarm of federal agents clad in dark tactical vests poured out onto the asphalt. They moved with absolute overwhelming authority. The lead agent barked a deafening command, ordering Bradley to drop his keys and get his hands in the air. Bradley froze his mind, entirely unable to process the speed of the ambush. He did not have time to comply before two agents closed the distance. A heavy hand grabbed Bradley by the shoulder, spinning him around with brutal, unyielding force. He was slammed face first against the blistering hot hood of his own luxury SUV. The physical impact knocked the remaining oxygen out of his lungs, leaving him gasping for air against the scorching metal. The sharp, unmistakable ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed across the parking lot. Kendra screamed in primal terror, backing away instinctively as additional agents swiftly surrounded her, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Bradley pressed his bruised cheek against the searing hood of the vehicle, completely immobilized by the crushing weight of the federal agent pinning his shoulders. The cold, unyielding steel of the handcuffs bit painfully into his wrists, cutting off his circulation. Throughout his entire adult life, built upon high-stakes real estate manipulation and illicit offshore gambling, Bradley had always maintained a smug, untouchable philosophy. He had spent years lounging in exclusive country clubs, drinking premium scotch, and constantly boasting to his associates that wealthy white-collar investors never faced actual physical consequences. He operated under the arrogant delusion that federal prison was an abstract concept reserved strictly for uneducated street-level criminals. He firmly believed that men who wore bespoke Italian suits and manipulated digital routing numbers were fundamentally immune to the violent realities of the justice system. In his distorted worldview, if a financial deal ever went sideways, a team of expensive corporate lawyers simply negotiated a fine, signed a non-disclosure agreement, and the problem vanished. The brutal physical reality of armed agents violently restraining him on the blistering asphalt thoroughly and completely shattered this lifetime of arrogant delusion. The heavy steel digging into his bones was not a negotiated fine. It was the absolute, undeniable termination of his freedom. He realized with sickening clarity that his wealth was entirely fabricated, his status was a fragile illusion, and his supposed immunity did not exist. He was pinned to the hood of a car purchased with stolen money, caught in a trap he had willingly walked into. The violent syndicate waiting at his house would never receive their $300,000, but the federal government had just permanently claimed his life. The sheer totality of his utter destruction left him physically paralyzed. The lead federal agent leaned in close to Bradley's ear, reciting the Miranda rights with a mechanical, terrifying precision that offered absolutely no room for negotiation. The agent did not raise his voice, but every single word landed like a devastating physical blow. He explicitly listed the severe federal charges moving forward. He cited interstate wire fraud conspiracy to commit forgery and aggravated elder financial abuse. Each distinct felony charge carried a mandatory minimum sentence that effectively guaranteed Bradley would spend the rest of his natural life behind reinforced concrete. Kendra watched the scene unfold with wide, unblinking eyes. The sight of her husband completely neutralized and handcuffed shattered the final remnants of her fabricated reality. The delusion of her guaranteed inheritance and effortless luxury dissolved into nothingness. The sheer terror of her impending arrest caused her knees to buckle entirely. She dropped onto the rough, unforgiving asphalt, the sharp gravel tearing the fabric of her expensive designer dress and scraping her skin. She sobbed uncontrollably, entirely defeated by the sudden violent collapse of her world. Through her tears, she looked up toward the wide concrete steps of the courthouse. I walked slowly out of the glass vestibule, flanked closely by Harrington. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the parking lot with an expression of absolute, impenetrable calm. Kendra saw my tailored suit and unwavering posture, instantly recognizing me as her final desperate lifeline. She ignored the armed agent standing over her and began to drag herself across the blistering pavement. She crawled toward the courthouse steps, weeping hysterically, begging for her father to intervene. She pleaded for salvation, promising to return everything and demanding I call off the federal authorities to save her life. Kendra's knees scraped harshly against the unforgiving asphalt as she dragged herself across the courthouse parking lot. She lunged forward, her trembling hands latching onto the crisp wool fabric of my tailored trousers. Her manicured nails dug desperately into the crease of my pant leg. She tilted her tear-streaked face upward, completely abandoning her carefully crafted facade of wealthy superiority. She wailed with primal terror, repeatedly calling me Papa, a tender childhood nickname she had not used since she was 8 years old. She squeezed my leg and babbled frantically about the ruthless syndicate enforcers waiting back at the house. She confessed everything about the massive gambling debts, the terrifying 24-hour deadline, and the immediate threat to their lives. The federal agents in the background were actively shoving a handcuffed, weeping Bradley into the back of an armored SUV. Kendra pointed a shaking finger at her husband, begging me to intervene. She pleaded with me to authorize the $300,000 bank transfer to pay off the violent mobsters and demanded I hire Harrington to secure Bradley's federal bail. She weaponized her tears, weaponized her panic, and weaponized the blood tie between us, fully expecting my ingrained paternal instinct to override decades of her relentless abuse. She clutched my shoes, sobbing hysterically, actively demanding that I liquidate the very estate she had just attempted to steal in order to rescue her from the catastrophic consequences of her own boundless greed. I looked down at the weeping woman clinging desperately to my shoes. I felt absolutely no anger, no pity, and no lingering paternal warmth. The well of my compassion had completely run dry. I spoke in a flat, unyielding baritone that cut directly through her hysterical sobbing. I calmly reminded her of the brutal, undeniable facts she had just forced the federal court to witness. I laid out the exact chronology of her betrayals. I reminded her how she had ruthlessly sold her mother's heirloom jewelry to fund a luxury vacation in the Florida Keys, completely erasing Naomi's physical memory for a fleeting moment of self-indulgence. I stated the undisputed reality of her conspiracy. She had actively paid a disgraced doctor to fabricate a diagnosis of severe senile dementia. She had meticulously planned to lock me inside a sterile psychiatric ward, heavily medicated and stripped of my basic human dignity, simply so she could liquidate my home to fuel Bradley's offshore gambling addiction. She stopped wailing and stared up at me, her mouth hanging slack in terrified shock. I did not raise my voice or offer any emotional leverage she could manipulate. I delivered the final inescapable verdict of her actions. I told her that the loving daughter I had raised effectively died the moment she conspired to throw me into a padded cell for a payout. I stated with absolute chilling finality that she was no longer my child. She was merely a parasite who had finally exhausted her host. The blood connection between us was permanently severed, completely dissolved by her own relentless, calculated cruelty. I reached inside the inner breast pocket of my charcoal suit jacket. I extracted a crisp, folded legal document bearing the fresh, embossed seal of the county court. I dropped the heavy paper directly onto the asphalt in front of her trembling hands. I explicitly informed her that the federal judge had just granted an emergency, immediate eviction order against her. I laid down the strict, non-negotiable parameters of her immediate future. She possessed exactly 1 hour to return to the estate and remove her personal clothing. I warned her that attempting to take any furniture, electronics, or items purchased with my stolen funds would result in an instant federal larceny charge. I stated that the moment the 60-minute deadline expired, a private security firm would permanently change every lock on the property and physically throw her into the street. She stared at the eviction notice as if it were a venomous snake, completely paralyzed by the sheer, crushing reality of her newfound poverty. I did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic excuse or manufacture another tear. I turned my back on her without a single ounce of hesitation. I walked with steady, unburdened strides toward the sleek black town car idling at the edge of the parking lot. Harrington stood waiting by the open rear door, projecting a grim, satisfied smile. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, completely turning my back on the wreckage of my former family. The heavy door slammed shut, severing my physical connection to Kendra forever. Kendra remained collapsed on the sun-baked asphalt, her expensive designer dress soaked in sweat and grime. She watched the black town car glide smoothly out of the courthouse parking lot, taking away her last conceivable lifeline. The federal agents had already departed, taking Bradley directly to a high-security holding facility to await his arraignment for interstate wire fraud. She was entirely alone, completely stripped of her home, her husband, and her endless stream of stolen wealth. A sharp, aggressive vibration buzzed from inside her discarded handbag. Kendra flinched, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She crawled toward the expensive leather purse and pulled out her smartphone. The screen illuminated with a secure, encrypted text message from an unknown local number. She read the short, terrifying sentences, her blood instantly turning to ice. The message bluntly stated that Bradley's sudden federal incarceration did not erase the outstanding syndicate ledger. The massive $300,000 gambling debt had been instantly and non-negotiably transferred directly to her. The anonymous sender detailed her exact current location in the courthouse parking lot, proving they were actively watching her every move. The message concluded with a chilling, absolute ultimatum. She had until midnight to produce the cash, or the enforcers would track her down and extract the payment in blood. Kendra dropped the phone onto the concrete, letting out a suffocated, horrified gasp. She had precisely 1 hour to pack her meager belongings and less than 10 hours to flee the city completely. The hunters she had unleashed upon me had violently pivoted, transforming the arrogant daughter into their ultimate desperate prey. 3 months evaporated into the sweltering heat of the fading Atlanta summer. The swift and brutal efficiency of the federal justice system had completely consumed Bradley. He pleaded guilty to interstate wire fraud conspiracy and aggravated elder abuse to avoid a lengthy public trial, resulting in a mandatory 15-year sentence inside a high-security federal penitentiary. The arrogant financial predator was now just another assigned inmate number navigating the terrifying, violent reality of a concrete cell block. His expensive, tailored suits were permanently replaced by a coarse khaki uniform. Kendra experienced a completely different kind of incarceration. She fled across state lines on the very night of the courthouse disaster, driven by the absolute terror of the anonymous syndicate ultimatum. She currently resided in a dilapidated, roach-infested motel off a forgotten stretch of a South Carolina highway. The peeling floral wallpaper and damp, stained carpet served as her new permanent sanctuary. Her days of idle luxury and endless shopping sprees were entirely dead. To satisfy the relentless violent demands of the debt collectors, Kendra worked grueling, back-breaking night shifts as an industrial janitor at a local meatpacking facility. She spent her nights scrubbing congealed blood and grease from concrete floors under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Her hands, once perfectly manicured and soft, were now cracked, blistered, and permanently stained with harsh industrial bleach. The syndicate garnished 90% of her meager wages, leaving her just enough cash to cover her weekly motel rent and basic sustenance. She lived in a perpetual state of exhausting, bone-deep terror, constantly looking over her shoulder for the dark sedans that haunted her nightmares. She was entirely trapped in a ruthless cycle of manual labor and extortion, completely isolated from the wealthy world she had so arrogantly believed was her birthright. A profound, absolute silence descended upon my estate. I stood at the edge of the freshly paved driveway and watched a dedicated team of professional contractors apply a crisp, vibrant coat of ivory paint to the exterior of the house. The shattered front door had been completely removed and replaced by a reinforced solid oak entryway featuring heavy brass fixtures. The physical scars left by the syndicate enforcers were entirely erased. The transformation extended far beyond the exterior plaster and wood. I had systematically purged the interior of the house, stripping away every single item tainted by the presence of Kendra and Bradley. I hired a local liquidation firm to haul away the ostentatious leather sofas, the ridiculous modern art pieces, and the expensive electronics they had purchased using my stolen funds. I scrubbed the house clean of their toxic residue. Every photograph containing Kendra's face was taken down from the hallway gallery, shredded into tiny pieces, and deposited into the curbside incinerator. I refused to let my sanctuary serve as a museum for a treacherous parasite. The spacious rooms now echoed with a clean, airy emptiness. The air smelled of fresh pine cleaner and raw cedar rather than Kendra's heavy, cloying designer perfume. I walked through the empty living room, my dress shoes clicking rhythmically against the newly polished hardwood floors. I felt a tremendous weight permanently lift from my shoulders. The suffocating anxiety of walking on eggshells inside my own home was completely gone. The agonizing burden of financing a destructive, ungrateful daughter had been decisively severed. I reclaimed my territory piece by piece, transforming a house of deception back into a fortress of absolute tranquility. The structure was finally clean, acting as a blank canvas awaiting its true ultimate purpose. Naomi always possessed a fiercely protective spirit that extended far beyond the walls of our marriage. During the final grueling years of her terminal illness, she spent countless hours watching investigative reports detailing the horrific reality of elder abuse. She was deeply haunted by the stories of vulnerable senior citizens who were systematically isolated, financially drained, and emotionally broken by their own greedy family members. Naomi recognized the exact same predatory traits developing within our own daughter. She refused to let her lifetime of hard work fuel Kendra's toxic vanity. The $5 million offshore trust was never simply a defensive measure designed to block Bradley's gambling debts. It was the financial cornerstone of a much larger, profoundly compassionate vision. Naomi spent her final months secretly drafting blueprints and securing zoning permits to transform our spacious property into a dedicated, high-security shelter for elderly victims of domestic financial abuse. She envisioned a heavily protected sanctuary where seniors could live, rent-free, receive top-tier medical care, and access aggressive legal representation to reclaim their stolen assets. She intentionally hid this massive philanthropic project from Kendra, knowing her daughter would immediately try to sabotage any endeavor that diverted funds away from her luxury lifestyle. Naomi entrusted me with the singular mission of bringing her ultimate legacy to life. Standing in the sunlit foyer of the freshly renovated house, I finally felt the true magnitude of her brilliant foresight. She had engineered an immaculate mechanism that simultaneously destroyed the parasites feeding on our family and created a permanent shield for those who could not defend themselves. I was no longer merely a retired widower defending his property. I was the appointed guardian of Naomi's final magnificent gift to the world. And the facility was finally ready to open its doors. The sharp crunch of heavy tires rolling over the gravel driveway broke the morning silence. A sleek black luxury sedan pulled smoothly up to the newly painted front porch. Harrington stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting the lapels of his sharp navy suit. He did not carry his usual battered litigation briefcase. Instead, he held a thick, beautifully crafted black leather binder pressed tightly against his side. He walked up the concrete steps with a grim, deeply satisfied smile resting on his face. He extended his hand, and we shared a firm, quiet handshake that acknowledged the absolute destruction of our mutual enemies and the successful execution of our long-term strategy. We walked into the bright, empty living room and stood over a small, temporary folding table set up in the center of the space. Harrington opened the leather binder, revealing a stack of perfectly organized, heavily vetted federal documents. He explained that these were the final, irrevocable transfer deeds. The paperwork would officially and permanently transition the entire property, the vintage truck, and the $5 million trust out of my personal name. The assets would be legally absorbed into a newly registered, federally protected nonprofit organization bearing Naomi's name. Harrington tapped a manicured finger against the bottom signature line, stating that once the ink dried, the estate would become an untouchable fortress of charity, completely immune to any future familial claims or civil litigation. The house would officially belong to the sanctuary. I reached into the breast pocket of my charcoal suit and pulled out my heavy silver fountain pen. I stared down at the crisp white paper, feeling the immense comforting presence of my late wife guiding my hand. I slowly uncapped the pen, ready to finalize her beautiful revenge. The heavy silver fountain pen glided across the thick, textured paper with bold, deliberate strokes. I signed my name at the bottom of the final transfer deed, the ink gleaming wet for a brief second before settling permanently into the fibers. Harrington carefully collected each page, verifying the signatures with his usual meticulous precision. With that single fluid motion of my wrist, the sprawling property officially ceased to be my private residence. It was legally reborn as the Naomi Community Center. The $5 million offshore trust was now seamlessly integrated into the nonprofit organization's impenetrable financial architecture. Harrington closed the black leather binder, sealing away the legal mechanism that shielded my entire accumulated wealth from any future claims by blood relatives. Kendra possessed absolutely no legal avenue to contest this maneuver. I had completely isolated my assets, placing them behind a fortress of federal protections and charitable designations. The agonizing chapter of financial extortion and emotional blackmail was definitively closed. I sat back in the leather chair, feeling a profound sense of structural integrity return to my life. The chaotic, destructive storm brought on by my daughter and her husband had been completely neutralized. Order was permanently restored. The estate that had once served as a battleground for greed and entitlement was now completely immunized against their toxic influence. I had executed Naomi's ultimate vision with flawless precision, transforming our personal sanctuary into a permanent fortress for the vulnerable. Harrington gave a firm nod of approval, recognizing the absolute finality of the transaction. The legal snare we had meticulously constructed was no longer a weapon. It was a shield standing tall and utterly unbreakable. Harrington reached into the interior pocket of his tailored navy suit jacket and withdrew a thick, crumpled envelope. He placed it softly on the table, pushing it across the polished wood toward me. He explained that his office had received the parcel via certified mail earlier that morning, forwarded directly from a dilapidated motel located just across the South Carolina border. The return address bore Kendra's sprawling, frantic handwriting. I picked up the envelope, noting the heavy weight of the pages inside. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out 4 densely packed sheets of notebook paper. The pages were covered in erratic ink, tear-stained and desperate. It was a sprawling manifesto of apologies, excuses, and frantic begging for a second chance. Kendra detailed her grueling night shifts and the crushing reality of her syndicate debt, practically demanding my financial salvation under the guise of familial repentance. She swore she had changed, promising to be the devoted daughter I had always wanted. I did not read beyond the first frantic paragraph. I did not allow her manufactured sorrow to penetrate my thoughts. Her apologies were nothing more than the desperate cries of a parasite abruptly cut off from its host. I stood up from the table and walked methodically toward the large stone fireplace anchoring the living room. A warm, crackling fire burned steadily on the hearth, chasing away the faint chill of the late afternoon. I held the 4 pages over the dancing orange flames. I simply let go. The heat consumed the paper, instantly turning her desperate pleas into brittle black ash that floated harmlessly up the chimney. I watched the last glowing ember fade into gray dust. The physical destruction of her letter matched the absolute finality in my heart. She had made her choices, and I had absolutely no intention of mitigating her consequences. I left the living room and walked down the quiet corridor to what was once the master suite. The space had been entirely repurposed into my new executive office for the community center. Sunlight streamed through the large bay windows, illuminating the fresh paint and the sturdy mahogany desk positioned squarely in the center of the room. I walked over to the desk and reached into my pocket, pulling out the heavy gold pendant I had carried with me since the very beginning of this ordeal. The polished metal caught the afternoon light, gleaming with a warm, steady brilliance. I ran my thumb over the intricate engravings on the surface, feeling the weight of the history it represented. I pressed the small release catch on the side. The medallion snapped open with a sharp, satisfying click. I stared down at the empty circular space inside the locket. The physical space where Kendra's photograph had once resided was now completely bare. For months, that dark void had symbolized an agonizing betrayal, a constant, painful reminder of the daughter I had lost to boundless greed and arrogance. Now, as I stood in the heart of Naomi's realized legacy, the emptiness felt entirely different. It no longer represented a shattered family or a stolen future. The hollow space inside the gold pendant was the physical embodiment of absolute liberation. It was a clean slate, thoroughly scrubbed of toxic obligations and emotional manipulation. I snapped the locket shut and slipped it back into my pocket. I did not need a photograph to validate my existence or measure my worth. The heavy burden of unconditional paternal loyalty had been entirely lifted. I was free to define my legacy on my own terms, surrounded by a purpose that genuinely mattered. I stepped out through the new oak front doors and walked onto the expansive wraparound porch. The late summer heat was finally breaking, yielding to a crisp, refreshing evening breeze. The sun began its slow descent over the sprawling Atlanta skyline, painting the horizon in deep, brilliant shades of bruised purple and burning gold. I stood at the wooden railing looking out over the quiet, manicured grounds of the newly established sanctuary. The brutal trials of the past few months had cemented a harsh but necessary truth in my mind. Blood ties do not guarantee genuine loyalty. Genetic connections do not automatically earn respect, and familial titles do not grant immunity from the consequences of profound betrayal. I had faced a coordinated, malicious assault from the very people who should have protected me. I did not defeat them by raising my voice, throwing tantrums, or engaging in public emotional warfare. True power does not require a loud voice or chaotic desperation. I had engineered a silent, ruthless adjustment of the natural order. I utilized patience, intellect, and unbreakable resolve to systematically dismantle their criminal conspiracy. I had successfully honored my late wife's final, magnificent vision while simultaneously reclaiming complete ownership of my own life. The predators who sought to lock me away in a sterile cage were now trapped in prisons of their own making. I took a deep, steadying breath, filling my lungs with the cool, clean evening air. The oppressive weight of the past was permanently gone. I stood tall on the porch of the Naomi Community Center, completely unburdened, entirely victorious and absolutely free. The lead federal agent leaned in close to Bradley's ear, reciting the Miranda rights with a mechanical, terrifying precision that offered absolutely no room for negotiation. The seasoned agent did not raise his voice, but every single spoken word landed like a devastating physical blow. He explicitly listed the severe federal charges moving forward. He cited interstate wire fraud conspiracy to commit document forgery and aggravated elder financial abuse. Each distinct felony charge carried a mandatory minimum sentence that guaranteed Bradley would spend the rest of his natural life isolated behind reinforced concrete. Kendra watched the horrifying scene unfold with wide, unblinking eyes. The sight of her husband completely neutralized and aggressively handcuffed shattered the final remnants of her fabricated reality. The deeply held delusion of her guaranteed inheritance and effortless luxury dissolved into nothingness. The sheer terror of her impending arrest and the looming syndicate debt caused her knees to buckle entirely. She dropped onto the rough, unforgiving asphalt, the sharp gravel tearing the delicate fabric of her expensive designer dress and scraping her bare skin. She sobbed uncontrollably, entirely defeated by the sudden violent collapse of her entire world. Through her blurry tears, she looked up toward the wide concrete steps of the courthouse. I walked slowly out of the glass vestibule, flanked closely by Harrington. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the parking lot with an expression of absolute impenetrable calm. Kendra saw my tailored suit and unwavering posture, instantly recognizing me as her final, desperate lifeline. She ignored the armed agent standing over her and began to drag herself across the blistering pavement. She crawled toward the courthouse steps, weeping hysterically, begging her father for immediate financial salvation. True power is never found in loud declarations or arrogant boasts, but in the quiet, calculated execution of justice. When greed blinds individuals to the value of human connection, they inevitably orchestrate their own downfall. This story teaches us that unconditional love should never become a tool for exploitation. Establishing firm boundaries and holding abusers accountable is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary reclamation of personal dignity. Do not let toxic family members weaponize your compassion. If you found this story empowering, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.